Section 0 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Algie Pug. An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt, Professor of English, University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. Introduction. A careful study of Endymion, made some 10 years ago, led to the conclusion that there was more of allegorical significance in the poem than had hitherto been recognised. But the effort to trace that significance was only partially successful. Further study since that time has gradually opened up the way to the interpretation that is worked out in the following pages. It is probable that there are details in the story, the meaning of which still lies hidden, but it may at least be hoped that enough has been discovered to win for the poem its rightful place among the not very numerous examples in English poetry of well-wrought allegory. It will be seen that frequent reference has been made to Sir Sidney Colvin's recently published Life of Keats, 2nd edition, 1918, which has superseded all other authorities on the subject, and, while the interpretation of Endymion, here put forward, differs largely from his treatment of that poem, it is pleasant to have the opportunity of giving expression to the deep sense of gratitude which all lovers of Keats must feel for his scholarly and sympathetic work. Stellenbosch, South Africa, 10th of March, 1919. It is a strange habit of wise humanity to speak in enigmas only, so that the highest truths and usefulest laws must be hunted for through whole picture galleries of dreams, which to the vulgar seem dreams only. Ruskin. An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion. Endymion an Allegory. It is generally agreed that in writing Endymion, Keats intended to do something more than merely to retell an old legend. He does not appear, so far as the records go, to have left any definite statement to that effect, but there are indications that point distinctly to such a purpose. The poem beginning, "I stood tiptoe upon a little hill," with which his first volume, published in March 1817, opens, had originally been called Endymion, but was afterwards left without a title, because Keats had decided to make a more ambitious effort to handle the same subject. And the significant fact, for our present purpose, is that the earlier Endymion, while it touches lightly upon the old legend, is really concerned with the views of Keats on the philosophy of poetry. It would not then be surprising to find that the longer and more ambitious treatment of the story, upon which he set to work as soon as the earlier volume had appeared, embodied his views on the same subject, handled this time in a fuller and more elaborate manner. It is perhaps worth noting how much of his verse is concerned with this one theme, the training and function of the poet. In the volume of 1817, besides "I stood tiptoe," the epistles to his brother George, to Matthew, and to Cowden Clarke, and the more important Sleep and Poetry, all deal with this matter, and in one of his latest pieces of work, The Fall of Hyperion, he returns once more to the same theme. It is interesting also to find his thoughts on other matters running into the form of allegory during the time when he was working on the first book of Endymion. In May 1817 he writes to Taylor and Hesse, who afterwards published the poem, that he could make a nice little allegorical poem called The Dun, where we would have the Castle of Carelessness, the Drawbridge of Credit, Sir Novelty Fashion's expedition against the city of tailors, etc., etc., and turns immediately afterwards to the subject of Endymion. Lastly, it may be noted that there is a passage in the first book which might of itself almost settle the question of the real significance of the poem. It occurs in the talk of Endymion with Peona, lines 769 and following, and in it the mask is for the moment laid aside, and Keats himself speaks out in his own proper person. He asks, wherein lies happiness? And goes on to answer, in that which becks our ready minds to fellowship divine, a fellowship with essence, till we shine full alchemized and free of space. He proceeds to mark off the various grades of happiness, starting from the sympathy that can enter into the wonders and aspirations of former days, and passing on through friendship to love, which may produce more than our searching witnesseth. And if earthly love, he goes on to say, can lift us far above the ordinary level of life, what power must lie in a passionate endeavour to reach up to a divine ideal? It is fortunate that a record remains showing that Keats attached particular importance to this passage. The lines quoted above were not in the original poem, and in sending them to his publisher, as the poem was passing through the press, he wrote, "You must indulge me by putting this in, for setting aside the badness of the other, such a preface is necessary to the subject. The whole thing must, I think, have appeared to you, who are a consecutive man, as a thing almost of mere words, but I can assure you that, when I wrote it, it was a regular stepping of the imagination towards a truth. My having written that argument will perhaps be of the greatest service to me of anything I ever did. It set before me the gradations of happiness, even like a kind of pleasure thermometer, and is my first step towards the chief attempt in the drama." It is evident then that there was much more in the mind of Keats when he wrote this poem than the retelling of an old and fantastic tale. But, of course, the final justification for this view of Endymion must lie in the poem itself. If, as it is hoped to show, there is to be found, running beneath the surface of the poem in a clear and unbroken stream, a meaning that corresponds closely with the ideas that are known to have filled the mind of Keats at this time, there will be no need of further argument on the matter. An allegory of this kind does not slip into a poem by accident. But it may fairly be asked, why did not Keats himself do something to elucidate the meaning of a poem which, though it cost him so much effort, seems to have been understood by few, if indeed by any, in his own time, and which, even at this late day, has scarcely yielded up its full treasure of meaning? Two facts may supply a sufficient answer to this query. The first is that, before he had finished the poem, Keats became dissatisfied with and tired of it. This feeling shows itself repeatedly in his letters. Soon after he had reached the end of the third book, he wrote to Haydn, "My ideas with respect to it, I assure you, are very low, and I would write the subject thoroughly again. But I am tired of it, and think the time would be better spent in writing a new romance which I have in my eyes for the next summer." And some time later to Reynolds, "I have copied my fourth book, and shall write the preface soon. I wish it was all done, for I want to forget it and make my mind free for something new." And then the unintelligent and unfair criticism with which the poem was received by most of those who noticed it, and, what was almost worse, the indifference of the greater part of the literary world, would offer but a slender inducement to enter upon an explanation of its meaning. If even the few friends who took up his defence failed to interpret it rightly, what could be expected from those who began to read it with minds prejudiced against the author? So he held his peace. He probably felt as unwilling to explain his allegory as a humorist would be to explain one of his jokes that had fallen flat, and, moreover, he would know that any such defence would only give occasion for fresh ridicule. The main intention. Accepting the presence of an allegory as a working hypothesis, we may next try to define its main intention. It is true that any attempt to state, in matter-of-fact prose, the significance of an allegory must inevitably be unsatisfactory. A painting of a sunset or of waves breaking on the shore is unsatisfactory, for how can one reproduce on canvas the constantly shifting play of light and colour which makes the real beauty of the scene? Yet we find pleasure in the attempt, and in the case of the allegory, where a more purely intellectual element is involved, an attempt to define its purpose has a real value in clearing one's way towards an understanding of the problems involved. Definitions and criticisms. Professor de Selincourt has described the allegory as representing the development of the poet's soul towards a complete realization of itself. Mr. A. C. Bradley says, "The adventures of Endymion are also the experiences of the poetic soul in its search for union with the absolute beauty." Sir Sidney Colvin gives a fuller definition. "The essence of Keats' task is to set forth the craving of the poet for full communion with the essential spirit of beauty in the world, and the discipline by which he is led, through the exercise of the active human sympathies and the toilsome acquisition of knowledge, to the prosperous and beatific achievement of his quest." Each of these writers, however, proceeds to remark upon the imperfect way in which the intention has been carried out. Professor de Selincourt, after a brief sketch of the purpose of the poem, adds, "It is hardly safe to give a more detailed interpretation of the allegory, for, as a whole, Endymion is vague and obscure." Sir Sidney Colvin, while in some places taking up a more thorough-going attitude of defence than previous writers had adopted, yet says, "In Endymion, Keats had impeded and confused his narrative by working into it much incident and imagery symbolic of the cogitations and aspirations, the upliftings and misgivings of his own unripe spirit," and quotes with approval Shelley's remark, "I think if he had printed about 50 pages of fragments from it, I should have been led to admire Keats as a poet more than I ought, of which there is now no danger." Mr. A. C. Bradley is more severe. The result is a series of adventures to the details of which it is impossible to assign a distinct symbolic meaning, and which, taken more simply, have the incoherence of a broken dream. That there are many faults of expression, and not a few lapses from good taste, in all the earlier work of Keats, cannot be denied, and Endymion is by no means free from these defects, but it is hoped to show that there is a fuller and more consecutive meaning running through the whole poem than has yet been recognised, that many of the details which have been thought to be superfluous and unmeaning are significant and appropriate when viewed from the right standpoint, and that much of the criticism that has been directed against it is mistaken and irrelevant, since it is based upon a failure to understand the meaning and purpose of the passages criticised. A double purpose. In trying to arrive at a satisfactory statement of the underlying meaning of the poem, it is necessary to recognise that the allegory appears to have a double purpose, to carry at once a wider and a narrower meaning, the wider meaning having reference to the new birth of poetry which came about as soon as the power of the pseudo-classical school declined, and English poetry was released from what Keats regarded as the cramping and deadening influence that Pope and his associates had exercised, the narrower being intended to give some account of the experience of an individual, picturing the rise and development of the poetic passion in his mind, his earnest pursuit and gradual realisation of the ideal that is set before him. In some parts of the poem the two ideas can be recognised side by side, but usually one or the other is dominant for the time. Thus, in the first book, the earlier part is a picture of the spirit of the time in which the revival of poetry began, while the rest of the book deals with the more personal aspect of the subject. One need not be surprised to find this double purpose at work. Keats was an enthusiastic admirer of Spenser, and the Fairy Queen would furnish him with a precedent that would be warrant enough for such a plan. It would indeed have been difficult to keep the two ideas apart from one another, for the impulses that were stirring in the mind of Keats and were urging him on to develop his own gift of song were but part of the great tidal movement that was flooding in through many channels, and he was clear-sighted enough to recognise the fact. If we look at the sonnet that he addressed to Haydn in a letter of November 1816, "Great spirits now on earth are sojourning," in which he refers to Wordsworth, Leigh Hunt, and Haydn himself as pioneers of a new era, and then read another letter addressed to Haydn in the following May, when working at Endymion, in which he quotes the following lines of Love's Labours Lost: "Let fame, that all pant after in their lives, live registered upon our brazen tombs, and so grace us in the disgrace of death. And adds, to think that I have no right to couple myself with you in this speech would be death to me. We can see how he thought of his own ambitions and ideals as connected with the wider movement that he saw to be in progress, not as a matter of boasting, but as the recognition of simple fact. It may further be noted that the same collocation of ideas is to be found in Sleep and Poetry, which had been published a little while before he seriously took up the writing of Endymion. In this poem he had denounced, in terms that roused the wrath of Byron, those that went about holding a poor decrepit standard out, marked with most flimsy mottos, and in large the name of one Boileau, and had gone on to celebrate the advent of happier times, now 'tis a fairer season, and then had linked with all this the hope that he himself might be found worthy to play some part in this great poetic revival. We may now try to ascertain what light can be gained on the purpose of the poem from a closer examination of the text. End of section. Section 1 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1. The Story. The story, so far as it is developed in the first book, falls into two clearly marked divisions. The first of these, covering about 1/3 of the total length of the book, lines 63 to 393, describes the Festival of Pan. The second, lines 393 to 992, deals with the strange experiences which have changed the life of Endymion. It will be convenient to consider these separately. The Festival of Pan. It is on the side of Mount Latmos, near the western coast of Asia Minor, that the festival is about to be held. On the slopes of the mountain lay a dense forest, into some parts of which no man had penetrated, line 67. Sometimes a lamb, straying away from the flock to which it belonged, would be lost in the depths of the forest, but it was believed that such a lamb would be shielded from harm until it joined the herds of Pan, and that the shepherd who had lost it would gain thereby, line 78. There were many paths in the forest leading to a wide lawn, in the midst of which stood an altar, line 90. To this spot, early in the morning of a summer day, a troop of children came and gathered round the altar, and, as they stood expectant, a faint breath of music came to their ears, line 114. Soon there appeared a troop of maidens and of shepherds, then a venerable priest, followed by more shepherds, and a joyous multitude accompanying a chariot drawn by 3 steeds, in which rode Endymion, their prince. They were gathered round the shrine, while the priest exhorted them to join in giving thanks to Pan for all the benefits they had received. After sacrifice and libation, a hymn to Pan was sung, line 232, and then many of those present joined in dancing and sports, while others allowed their minds to dwell on thoughts and images called up by what was going on around them, and as they played or meditated, the sun arose in all his glory, line 350. On one side sat a group of old men, who were talking with one another about the next life, the duties that lay before them, and the hopes of reunion with those they had loved. The meaning. It may be admitted at the outset that this earlier part of the first book is not the most hopeful part of the poem in which to attempt the tracing of the allegory. As an introduction to the story, it is simple and effective, but indications that would point out the purpose beneath the surface of the narrative are not easy to find. By making use, however, of clues to be found in later parts of the poem, we can arrive at a fair degree of certainty as to the intention of this earlier part. A widespread poetic feeling. It appears, then, that we have here shown to us, in the manner of a picture, the feeling that was abroad among men at the time when the new romantic movement began to exercise its influence. It is not only in the mind of the poet that such a movement stirs and grows, there must be a stirring, too, in the minds of many others who will never be poets, and they must be ready to share in the new ideas and emotions in such degree as they are capable of. For some time past men had paid little heed to the beauty of the world around them. As Wordsworth had put it when Keats was 12 years old, "Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not." And it was a true charge that the old priest made when he said, "Our vows are wanting to our great God Pan," line 213. But a change was coming over the minds of men. They were tired of the wrangling and the strife, the insincere compliment and the bitter jibe that made up so large a part of what poets had for a long time been saying to them. They were eager to respond to Wordsworth's invitation. "Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher." They were ready to join in the desire that this new spirit of delight in and wonder at all that is beautiful and mysterious in nature might spread among mankind. They could sing, "Be still the leaven that, spreading in this dull and clodded earth, gives it a touch ethereal, a new birth. Be still a symbol of immensity, a firmament reflected in a sea." Line 296. The main purpose of this opening part of the story is to show the new movement as one that was shared by many people. Young and old, men, women and children were alike stirred by it, and the suggestion at the back of the story is that the change that came about in the world of poetry at this time was not merely the result of new ideas and a fresh outlook on the part of the poets. It was the expression of a spiritual change that had taken place in the minds of large numbers of people. The revelation had come to the poet, as we shall see, in a way that was intimate and personal, and no one else could directly share in it, but there were many who, though quite unable to receive such a revelation as had come to him, still felt the throbbing of new impulses and shared in the new joy. The Altar and the Lawn. The revival of the worship of Pan stands for the fresh interest in and love of nature which were widely diffused at the time of the poetic revival. And bearing this in mind, a further significance may be recognised in some of the details of the story. It will be remembered that a marble altar (line 90) stood in the middle of the wide lawn (line 82) where this festival took place, and that there were many paths leading through the forest to this spot. It would appear that Keats intended to remind us that reverence for nature is no new thing. This part of the great domain of poetry had been opened up long before many paths led to it, and had been trodden by worshippers in earlier times. The altar that they had built, though it had been neglected for some time, still stood there ready for the worshippers when they were willing to gather round it. It may be noted, too, that it was before sunrise that the multitude came together to renew their vows to Pan, and then from the horizon's vaulted side there shot a golden splendour far and wide, spangling those million poutings of the brine with quivering awe. 'Twas even an awful shrine from the exaltation of Apollo's bow, a heavenly beacon in their dreary woe. Line 349. So the beginning of the freshly awakened interest in nature, as may be seen in the poems of Thomson and Collins and Gray, showed itself before the sunshine splendour of the new movement as it shone forth in the time of Wordsworth and Coleridge. It is difficult, if not impossible, to mark with accuracy the limits of significance intended by the poet in the details of his allegory. One cannot, for instance, be certain whether or not he meant the mighty forest outspread upon the sides of Latmos to represent the realm of poetry as a whole, and the gloomy shades, sequestered deep, where no man went. Line 67. to stand for some portions of that realm which Keats thought of as still remaining to be occupied, themes or aspects of life which were awaiting the poet of the future, in contrast with the lawn into which many paths led and where stood the altar to Pan, at which many poets had sacrificed. But there are a few lines, not in the main current of the story, in which we shall probably not be far wrong in recognising a partly personal reminiscence, also aside from the direct line of the allegory. The Strayed Lambs. They refer to the lamb that sometimes strayed far down those inmost glens (line 69) and never returned to join the flocks, but passed unworried by angry wolf or pard with prying head, until it came to some unfooted plains where fed the herds of Pan. Aye, great his gains, who thus one lamb did lose. Line 75. It seems likely that Keats was thinking of the fate of some of his own poems. There were many lambs in the white flock of his first published volume that had been worried by the angry wolves or pards with prying head, who howled in the pages of the Eclectic Review and other periodicals at Leigh Hunt and all who were suspected of being his friends. But there were other poems that he did not publish, some perhaps had not even been put into writing, and these were never, in his lifetime at any rate, gathered into the pens that held the main flock. Keats, regarding them in a way with which Browning would have fully sympathised, felt that these poems had not perished, but had joined the herds of Pan, and that the gain to him was great, for they lived on in his mind as beautiful ideals, unmarred by foolish or unfriendly criticism. There is, of course, no need to suppose that Keats intended to limit the application of the parable to his own experience. Many a poet must have had a similar feeling about his unpublished poems. Endymion's experiences. Thus far we have followed the story of the Festival of Pan. It remains to consider the latter part of the first book, which tells of the experiences through which Endymion had passed, and which had caused such a marked change in his demeanour. In earlier days he had been foremost in all active exercises, but now he seemed to be oppressed by some secret grief, and could not join in the festivities of the day. Line 393. His sister Peona drew him from the crowd and took him to a quiet retreat, where, under her restful influence, he fell asleep. Line 442. When he awoke, refreshed and grateful for her sisterly affection, he told her the cause of the change that had come upon him. He had seen a vision of surpassing loveliness, line 572, and though it was but a dream and had passed away, leaving him desolate, it had been followed by a second appearance of the same bright face, mirrored in a clear well, line 895. This was no dream, for he saw it with waking eyes, but it, too, had quickly vanished. Finally, as he was one day following the course of a stream, he had reached a quiet and beautiful cave, line 935, and as he longed with a great longing for the presence of the unknown goddess whom he had come to love so deeply, he heard her voice calling him, and realised that she was with him once more. But those moments had quickly fled, and feeling now the hopelessness of his passion, he declared that he would put his grief aside and return to a quiet and wholesome life. Keats' early interests. In this part of the story it is not difficult to trace Keats' own reminiscences of the way in which there gradually grew up within him the conviction that he must devote himself to the pursuit of poetry, until that became at length the one absorbing passion of his life. Endymion's days, as he himself tells us, had until recently been marked by healthy activity. He was full of energy and delighted in manly exercises. He was one who, for very sport of heart, would race with his own steed from Araby, pluck down a vulture from his towery perching, frown a lion into growling. Line 533. And Keats, according to the account of his school friends, showed a similar disposition in his early days. One of them, Mr. Edward Holmes, has left the following record. Keats was in childhood not attached to books. His penchant was for fighting. He would fight anyone, morning, noon and night, his brother among the rest. It was meat and drink to him. He was not literary. His love of work and poetry manifested itself chiefly about the year before he left school. In all active exercises he excelled. But a change had come over Endymion. He no longer took any interest in the manly sports that had hitherto been his chief delight. He had lost all his toil-breeding fire (line 537), and at times he became oblivious of all that was going on around him. He did not heed the sudden silence, or the whispers low, or the old eyes dissolving at his woe, or anxious calls, or close of trembling palms, or maiden sigh that grief itself embalms, but in the self-same fixed trance he kept, like one who on the earth had never stepped. Line 398. His love of poetry awakened. So Keats pictures to us the change that comes over a man's outlook on life when once he has heard the call to devote himself to the pursuit of poetry. Hitherto he has led a life not differing in any marked way from the life of his fellows. He has joined in the same pursuits and has shared in their interests and pleasures. But when once he has caught a glimpse of an ideal loftier and more beautiful than anything that has hitherto entered into his conception of life, he cannot go on as before. The old pursuits and pleasures seem empty and meaningless. He becomes absorbed in the contemplation of the new ideal. It fascinates him and alters his whole attitude to life. Endymion speaks of "the change wrought suddenly in me" (line 520), and though it is not for a long time that he fully makes up his mind to devote himself to the pursuit of the new ideal, it is clear that Keats intends us to think of the experience that resulted in the new outlook upon life as having taken place on some definite and identifiable occasion. His isolation. It may further be noted that the experience is a rare one. Not many men are called to be poets, and in the story it is Endymion alone of all the people who sees the vision and hears the call. For the most part, the people around him are quite unable to enter into his feelings, though there are a few of more sympathetic understanding who are able to share a little in them. He seemed, to common lookers on, like one who dreamed of idleness in groves Elysian. But there were some who feelingly could scan a lurking trouble in his nether lip, and see that oftentimes the reins would slip through his forgotten hands. Then would they sigh, and think of yellow leaves, of owlet's cry, of logs piled solemnly. Line 175. This isolation of the poet, the solitariness of the path that he has to follow through life, is a point frequently insisted upon in the allegory. It is a pathetic illustration of the limited degree of sympathetic understanding with which the poet must expect to meet, that when Keats read to Wordsworth this beautiful hymn to Pan, a crystal vase containing as a distilled essence the very flower of Wordsworth's own teaching, all the comment that he passed upon it seems to have been that it was a pretty piece of paganism. Wordsworth, who had himself declared that he would rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, if only his eyes and ears might be open to the beauty and mystery of the world around him. If this was all the appreciation that Wordsworth had to offer, it seems unreasonable to speak severely of the obtuseness of later critics, and even a quarterly reviewer should be pitied rather than blamed. The Threefold Revelation. The story of the threefold revelation that was granted to Endymion is skilfully worked out. It is obviously intended to represent the growth in a man's mind of the consciousness that he is called to be a poet. It may be true that the poet is born, not made, but at any rate he is not conscious of the fact when he is born, nor for some time after. He may arrive at the consciousness in various ways, but Keats represents it here as coming to him first of all on a few definite occasions, and in such a way that from the time when the idea first dawned upon him, his whole outlook upon life was changed, even though some considerable time went by before he finally made up his mind to devote his life to this one purpose. There are four aspects of this part of the story that appear to be specially significant, and these may now be considered. The first vision in a familiar spot. 1. In the first place, it will be noticed that some stress is laid on the fact that when the new revelation came to Endymion, he was in a place that he had often been accustomed to visit. On the first occasion he was on the border of a wood, where the river winds round it, and there he had made his way to a nook, where he had been used to pass his weary eves, line 546, and from which he had often watched the beauty of sunset. And it was here, heralded by the sudden blossoming of a magic bed of flowers, that the vision came to him. The second. In the account of the second revelation, this feature of the story is dwelt upon at greater length. It was in a deep hollow, overarched by bushes and trees, where some moulded steps led down to the margin of a well. Line 870. From there he had often brought flowers to Peona. There too he would bubble up the water through a reed, or make ships of malted feathers, touchwood, alder chips, with leaves stuck in them, and the Neptune be of their petty ocean. Line 882. When in a less childish mood he often sat there, contemplating the figures wild of o'erhead clouds melting the mirror through. Line 886. It may be regarded as one of the canons in the interpretation of allegory that if apparently disproportionate stress is laid upon any aspect of the story, there is probably enshrined in it something of special significance in the allegory. In a carelessly constructed allegory this will not, of course, hold good, but the more one examines this poem, the more evidence one finds that the thinking has been close and consecutive, and that while the expression is in places immature and faulty, the conception is fine, and much more carefully worked out than has yet been admitted. In this instance the meaning is not difficult to trace, and it is of sufficient importance to justify the stress laid upon the matter. Keats appears to be telling us something of what led up to his realization of the wonderful beauty of real poetry. As a child he had, no doubt, often heard or read, and probably learned, poems or parts of poems. He had, perhaps, amused his sister in her baby days by repeating these to her, just as in later days he wrote nonsense rhymes for her. He may, very likely, have imitated verses of the great poets, picking up a feather moulted from one of their poems, a chip from their workshop, and making out of it a little craft of his own. In later days he would sit pondering on the way in which life is mirrored in such works, and it was here, on ground long familiar to him, in poems that he had known from childhood, that there came to him suddenly and unexpectedly a vision of the indescribable beauty that inspires all really great poetry. It is not an uncommon experience. Many of us have learned in childhood poems that have given us some degree of pleasure at the time, and then, in later years, we have one day found in them a charm of form and meaning that we never realised before. There is granted to us a glimpse of the beauty of poetry in itself, and we share, in some small degree, in the experience of Keats. But it is only a very few who are capable of seeing it as he saw it, or in whom it can arouse such an intensity of wonder and delight that it inspires them to make an Endymion of it. The third, on new ground. In contrast with the familiarity of the ground on which Endymion had met with these experiences, we find that the spot where the third revelation came to him is not spoken of as one of his earlier haunts. This time he has been hurling his lance from place to place and following at chance. Line 929. Till at last it struck through some young trees and fell into a brook, which led him to a cave, and the description suggests that all this part of the forest was new to him. It may well have been the case that after Keats had twice been surprised by the recognition of some unearthly beauty in poems that had for a long time been familiar to him, he began to read more widely, to wander at random through the realms of gold, and that in some place that he hit upon almost by chance, there came to him again, and more clearly than before, the sense of the surpassing loveliness to be met with in poetry. A solitary experience. 2. A more obvious point than the one dealt with above is the solitary character of these experiences. On each occasion Endymion was wandering quite alone when the revelation came to him, and this suggests one aspect of the experience through which the poet must pass. The inspirations that come to him, the visions of beauty that he sees, are intensely personal and individual experiences. Even if his day should be spent in a crowded city, in his poetic life no one can go with him. He may tell the story of it to others, but they can never share it. The vision is for him alone. The revelation's progressive. 3. A point that is well worked out is the progressive character of these experiences. Endymion's attention was first of all caught by a sudden blossoming of flowers in a familiar spot. He pondered over it until his head was dizzy and distraught. Line 565. At length he fell asleep, and then there came the vision, first of the moon. She did soar so passionately bright, my dazzled soul commingling with her argent spheres did roll through clear and cloudy. Line 593. And when she vanished, there came in her place one who seemed the high perfection of all sweetness. Line 607. Yet it was but a dream. Line 574. On the second occasion he was sitting near the well when a cloudy Cupid flew by, and he was just about to follow it when he saw the same bright face he tasted in his sleep, smiling in the clear well. Line 895. There is no suggestion this time of the distraction and confusion of mind that marked the former occasion, and, moreover, the vision appears to him not when he is asleep, but in his waking hours, and is followed by indications of the divine favour that are unmistakable. The third appearance comes when he is consciously longing for the presence of her who has become his ideal, and it shows a further advance in the fact that on this occasion he hears a voice calling to him, and is granted a fuller and more intimate revelation than before. Thus Keats has represented to us the way in which the poet gradually comes to a fuller realisation of what it is that he is called to do. He sees more and more clearly the beauty of the ideal that is set before him, and is filled more and more with a longing to attain it. It will be seen that a further stage in the realisation of the ideal is represented in the next book, Book 2, lines 714 to 827, while a final consummation is reached at the end of the poem. 4. Between these times of exaltation, Endymion sank into a mood of deep depression that gradually subsided into a quiet state of resignation as he made up his mind to put aside all thoughts of the ideal that seemed so impossible of attainment, and tried to resume his ordinary life. And then this contentment would be broken up by a fresh vision. This alternation between joyous hope and black despair is, of course, characteristic of the artistic temperament, and is one of the penalties that the poet has to pay for the sensitiveness without which he could not be a poet. But one cannot help suspecting that personal reminiscence played a large part in this phase of the story. Is Keats describing his own experience? And this brings us to the consideration of a question that cannot but arise as one endeavours to follow out the meaning of this poem. The question, that is, as to how far the experiences of Endymion represent the training and development of the poet in general, and how far they correspond to the personal experiences of Keats. The question is one that can never be fully answered. Keats himself is the only one who could have told us how far he was drawing upon memories of what he himself had gone through, and he has not spoken. Of his letters that have come down to us, only 24 belong to the period before he had finished Endymion, and these throw no direct and but little indirect light on the problem. On the other hand, a little consideration serves to show that in dealing with such a theme he must inevitably have drawn mainly upon his own experience. The only poet whose mind he could know with sufficient intimacy was himself. He was indeed friendly, in varying degrees, with Leigh Hunt, with Shelley, and with Wordsworth, and it is quite possible that in the many talks that Keats enjoyed with one or another of these, talks of which a few faint echoes have reached our ears, some ideas may have been thrown up that have been built into the structure of Endymion. Be this as it may, one can hardly doubt that the story of Endymion's effort to win the prize that was set before him is drawn, in the main, from the recollections that filled the mind of Keats of his own hopes and doubts and difficulties, and there are some parts of the story in which the identification is clear. The resemblance between the Endymion of the days before the visions, when his delight was in the exercise of physical energy, and Keats in his earlier school days, when he excelled in all active exercises and was not literary, has already been pointed out, and the parallel is the more striking because there is no reason whatever to suppose that it was in the mind of Mr. Holmes when he wrote down his recollection of Keats as he knew him at the age of 14. No less striking is the evidence of the change that came over Keats in the course of the next 5 or 6 years. Henry Stevens, one of the medical students who shared a room with him in London, has described his point of view in those days. Poetry was to his mind the zenith of all his aspirations, the only thing worthy the attention of superior minds, so he thought. All other pursuits were mean and tame. He had no idea of fame or greatness, but as it was connected with the pursuits of poetry or the attainment of poetical excellence. If the free and active life of Endymion in his earlier days is a reflection of the way in which Keats felt when he was 14, it is equally clear that the visions of divine beauty that came to Endymion afterwards, and the rapture that they aroused in him, represent the feelings with regard to poetry and poetic fame that, at this later period, dominated the mind of Keats. Of the intervening period there is scarcely any record, but one can feel little doubt that when we read the story of the way in which Endymion passed from the heights of enthusiasm to the depths of depression, and of the efforts that he made to recover a normal and reasonable frame of mind, we are learning of the inner experiences of the poet. Between the time of his leaving school, about August 1811, and the day when he dropped his medical studies and finally made up his mind to devote himself to poetry, about March 1817, he must have passed through many periods of doubt and uncertainty, of longing to reach the ideal that he saw shining before him, of despair at the poor prospects of attaining to it when he realized the feebleness of his own early efforts. He must have decided more than once to put it all on one side and to fall in with the wishes of those of his friends who were urging him to complete his medical studies. "No more," says Endymion to Peona, "will I count over, link by link, my chain of grief, no longer strive to find a half-forgetfulness in mountain wind blustering about my ears. Aye, thou shalt see, dearest of sisters, what my life shall be. What a calm round of hours shall make my days. There is a paly flame of hope that plays where'er I look, but yet I'll say 'tis naught. And here I bid it die. Have I not caught already a more healthy countenance?" Line 978. It is only in the pages of Endymion that the record of these perplexities and struggles may be found, but a late echo of them survives in a letter to Leigh Hunt, written in May 1817, soon after he had begun to work at this poem. "I vow that I have been down in the mouth lately at this work. The last 2 days, however, I have felt more confident. I have asked myself so often why I should be a poet more than other men, seeing how great a thing it is, how great things are to be gained by it, what a thing to be in the mouth of fame, that at last the idea has grown so monstrously beyond my seeming power of attainment that the other day I nearly consented myself to drop into a phaeton. A wider meaning. It would, however, be a mistake to push this identification too far. At certain points in the story, both in this book and later, it seems clear that Keats is drawing largely upon the memory of his own experiences in order to make his sketch more vivid and true. But it would misrepresent the purpose of the poem to suppose that Endymion regularly stands for Keats himself. He embodies a more general conception, and his story is intended to picture for us the kind of experience through which any poet who is worthy of the name must pass, while at times he represents a still wider idea, that of the spirit of the new romanticism. Peona. It remains to consider briefly the character of Peona and her significance in the story. She is represented as being devotedly attached to Endymion. When the trouble of his mind so weighed upon him that he lost all consciousness of those about him, it was she who led him away and soothed him into a refreshing sleep. She watched over him while he slept, and when he awoke she sang to soothe him, and then begged him to tell her what it was that had so strangely altered his character. But when he had told her of his wonderful dream, she quite failed to understand how such an experience could affect him so deeply. Is this the cause? This all? Yet it is strange and sad, alas, that one who through this middle earth should pass, most like a sojourning demigod, and have his name upon the harp-string, should achieve no higher bard than simple maidenhood, singing alone and fearfully. Line 721. How light must dreams themselves be, seeing they're more slight than the mere nothing that engenders them? Then, wherefore sully the entrusted gem of high and noble life with thoughts so sick? Why pierce high-fronted honour to the quick for nothing but a dream? Line 754. Endymion replied with some energy, but even after he had told her of the two later revelations, Peona gave no sign that she was able to enter into his feelings, and her influence so far prevailed that he was ready, at any rate for the moment, to return to the normal life of healthy activity from which he had so strangely been drawn away. Peona stands for a type of person whom we all know and admire. Simple, practical, unimaginative, but at the same time unselfish and affectionate, they form a most wholesome element in the scheme of life. We owe them more than we can tell. They have no glimpse of the meaning or power of lofty and far-away ideals. They believe in doing the practical duty that lies close at hand. They rejoice when they can draw the unpractical idealist down to the wholesome level of quiet everyday life. But when they fail to do this, they are no less ready to hover round with ministering cheerfulness. They may at times express a gentle surprise at, or even disapproval of, the wild unreasonableness of the dreamer. But the best of them, in whose number Peona may be reckoned, do not worry him, but, accepting the matter as being beyond their ken, retire into silent sympathy and practical helpfulness. Georgiana Keats. One cannot tell whether Keats had any actual person in mind in drawing the portrait of Peona. There is an interesting passage in a letter that he wrote to his friend Bailey not long after Endymion had appeared, in which he speaks of his brother George's wife. They had recently been married and were on the point of leaving for America. I had known my sister-in-law some time before she was my sister, and was very fond of her. I like her better and better. She is the most disinterested woman I ever knew. That is to say, she goes beyond degree in it. To see an entirely disinterested girl quite happy is the most pleasant and extraordinary thing in the world. Women must want imagination, and they may thank God for it. One may perhaps infer that Georgiana Keats had sat as an unconscious model for some of the features of Peona. But there is a passage in another letter, written to these young married people after they had settled in America that puts the matter in a different light. Your content in each other is a delight to me which I cannot express. The moon is now shining full and brilliant. She is the same to me in matter what you are to me in spirit. If you were here, my dear sister, I could not pronounce the words which I write to you from a distance. I have a tenderness for you and an admiration which I feel to be as great and more chaste than I have for any woman in the world. You will mention Fanny, his sister. Her character is not formed, her identity does not press upon me as yours does. This suggests that some of the qualities that appear in the sketch of Diana were derived from the warm affection and admiration that Keats felt for Georgiana. His sister was at this time only 14 years of age, and while the tone of warm affection in which Endymion speaks to Peona corresponds well with that pervading the really delightful letters that Keats both at this time and afterwards wrote to her, we can hardly suppose that her opinion as to the wisdom or otherwise of his devoting himself to the life of a poet was very pronounced. It is not, of course, to be supposed that either Georgiana or Fanny is at all closely represented in the character of Peona, but it may well be the case, as the passages quoted from his letters suggest, that the affectionate regard that Keats entertained for them was at the back of his mind in some parts of the story and influenced what he wrote. Fanny Keats. It is perhaps worth noting that Mr. Locker Lampson, who met Fanny many years later in Rome, she was married to Senor Valentin Llanos, a Spanish man of letters, found her, both in the matter of her affection for her brother John and her failure to understand him, singularly like the Peona of the poem. Whilst I was in Rome, Mr. Seven introduced me to Monsieur and Madame Valentin de Llanos, a kindly couple. He was a Spaniard, lean, silent, dusky, and literary, the author of Don Esteban and Sandoval. She was fat, blonde, and lymphatic, and both were elderly. She was John Keats' sister. I had a good deal of talk with her, or rather at her, for she was not very responsive. I was disappointed, for I remember that my sprightliness made her yawn. She seemed inert, and had nothing to tell me of her wizard brother, of whom she spoke as a mystery, with a vague admiration, but a genuine affection. She was simple and natural. I believe she is a very worthy woman. End of section 1. Section 2 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2. The Story. In the second book we are taken down into a region away from all the stir and movement of human life. Endymion, wandering in the forest, is still in a restless and dissatisfied mood, notwithstanding his promise to Peona, when his fancy is caught by a bud from which emerges a golden butterfly. Line 61. He follows it, and is led to the mouth of a cavern, where a nymph, rising from a fountain, warns him that he has yet far to go before he can attain to what he is striving after. Line 123. In response to a voice calling to him from the cavern, he makes his way down, and finds himself in a strange, though beautiful, region, from which all sign of human life has passed away. In the course of his wanderings he comes upon a temple with many ramifications. Line 257. He is led into a chamber where he sees Adonis sleeping, and while he is there, Venus comes and carries Adonis away. Line 581. He passes some magic fountains and is delighted with the changing shapes that they assume. Line 606. He has a vision of Cybele. Line 640. And then, the path failing him, he is carried by an eagle to a quiet bower. Line 670, where his long pursuit is rewarded by a fuller revelation of his heavenly love than has yet been granted to him. After she has left him, he sees the pursuit of Arethusa by Alpheus, line 936, and sympathises with their pains, and suddenly he finds himself moving in the depths of the ocean. Our study of the first book has led us to the conclusion that in the story of the strange experiences through which Endymion passed, there is pictured the gradual awakening of Keats to the possibility that he might hope to achieve fame as a poet, and the black despondency that settled down upon him in the long periods of waiting between the somewhat rare occasions when his hopes shone brightly. In the second book the story is continued. The hope once awakened in him could not be crushed by fears or hesitations, even though these might prevail for a time, and there is now set before us, in picturesque form, the process of training that had to be undergone in order that the poet might be made fit for the realisation of his ideal. Sir Sidney Colvin has admirably described the way in which the mind of Keats naturally worked. When he conceives or wishes to express general ideas, his only way of doing so is by calling up, from the multitudes of concrete images with which his memory and imagination are haunted, such as strike him as fitted by their colour and significance, their quality of association and suggestion, to stand for and symbolise the abstractions working in his mind, and in this concrete and figurative fashion he will be found, by those who take the pains to follow him, to think coherently and purposefully enough. Its meaning. The images with which we meet in the second book may at first seem strange and bizarre. The winding passages of the underground world, the silver grots, the orbed diamond, the forsaken temple, the magic fountains. These may well be called wild and fantastic imaginations beneath which Keats has so effectively hidden his symbolic purpose that readers, by no means unsympathetic, have been driven to doubt whether it is there at all. Even Sir Sidney Colvin, referring primarily to the description of the magic fountains that kept on changing their form, gives up the riddle and says, "This, and much else on the underground journey, seems to be the outcome of pure fancy and daydreaming on the poet's part, without symbolic purpose." Yet one cannot but feel that it is unlikely that Keats would allow himself to wander aimlessly from the point in a poem dealing with a subject that was to him of all things most vital and sacred, especially when one bears in mind the fact that it was just through such images that his ideas seemed most naturally to find expression. One need not abandon the hope that even in the strange and fantastic symbolism of this book Keats will be found, by those who take the pains to follow him, to think coherently and purposefully enough. The meaning, then, that is suggested as underlying the symbolism of this book is mainly a personal one. Keats is continuing the story of his preparation for the work of a poet. He tells us how he could not put aside the longing that he might, some day, be found worthy of this high calling, however far away such an ideal might seem, and how, by what seemed a happy chance, he was led to enter upon an earnest and thorough study of some of the great classical poets. He tells us how fascinating he found the study, and yet how, at times, he was oppressed by what seemed its deadness and want of relation to life as he knew it. And then we see how he came to recognise a greater beauty and significance in some of the old legends than he had hitherto perceived. And finally, he pictures the renewed assurance that came to him that he would one day reach the goal towards which he was striving. We must now examine the details of the story with a view to ascertaining how far the interpretation here suggested is supported by them. Endymion has found himself unable to return to his former life of healthy activity, as he had told Peona he would do. He cannot shake off the influence of the vision that has called to him again and again with growing clearness. And the interpretation of this part of the story follows naturally upon that which we have already recognised in the first book. When the idea of achieving fame as a poet had once laid hold of the mind of Keats, he could not shake it off. He might, at times, when the ideal seemed too far out of reach, resolve to turn back to medicine and surgery, and make a renewed effort to fit himself in the normal way for this profession. But the call of poetry became more and more insistent, and no effort of will, and no pressure from his guardian, could drive it out of his mind. The episode of the butterfly. The incident that breaks in upon his mood of depression leads on to the journey underground with which this book is mainly concerned. Endymion is sitting by a shady spring, and elbow deep, with feverous fingering, stems the upbursting cold. A wild rose tree pavilions him in bloom, and he doth see a bud which snares his fancy. Lo, but now he plucks it, dips its stalk in the water. How it swells! It buds, it flowers beneath his sight, and in the middle there is softly pight a golden butterfly, upon whose wings there must be surely charactered strange things, for with wide eye he wonders and smiles oft. Line 53. Endymion follows this little herald as it flutters away, and in the pursuit his mood of languor is changed into eagerness. It leads him to the side of a fountain pouring out near the mouth of a cavern. As it sips from the stream, it vanishes, but soon afterwards Endymion hears a voice calling to him, and looking round, he sees the nymph of the fountain, who tells him that it is she who, in the form of the butterfly, has led him to this place, and warns him that he has yet far to travel before he can hope to obtain the object of his desires. Footnote. This point has not always been understood, but it appears to be a necessary inference from the text. All I dare to say is that I pity thee, that on this day I've been thy guide. Book 2, line 121. End footnote. She vanishes, and Endymion is left with a sense of perplexity and disappointment. He watches the moon, now shining brightly, and though he does not recognise her oneness with his divine visitant, his spirit is stirred with an intense longing. He feels that he is almost sailing with her through the dizzy sky. Line 187. And as his passionate longing grows almost too great to bear, he hears a voice calling to him from the cavern and bidding him descend. Its meaning. The view that is to be taken of the meaning of this episode must depend on the interpretation that is given to the story of the underground wanderings of Endymion, to which it serves as an introduction. This will be considered in its place, but for the moment it may be taken as a working assumption that these wanderings are intended to represent the course of study in classical poetry that Keats carried on for some time. With this as a clue, one is led to recognise that Keats is here depicting an experience of which no other record remains, though we know that he must, at some time, have passed through it. He was not much more than 8 years old when he began to attend Mr. Clarke's school at Enfield, and how soon he took up the study of Latin we do not know, but we do know that at some period, probably during the last 2 years of his school life, classical story and poetry began to exercise a fascination upon him that is not usual in the case of a schoolboy, and we may gather that he is picturing to us his recollection of the occasion when he first felt this fascination. The actual experience, vivid though it may have been in the recollection of Keats, is presented to us in a manner that makes it by no means easy to recognise the meaning of the details. It reminds one of a photograph taken from an aeroplane, which, though concerned with actual and even familiar objects, shows them in a way that is difficult to interpret. But, read in the light of the idea stated above, it appears to mean that on some occasion, when Keats was deep in meditation, turning over the pages of some book, possibly Lempriere's Classical Dictionary, which, as Cowden-Clarke tells us, he appeared to learn during the latter months of his school life, he lighted upon some legend or story that snared his fancy. He read it and became interested in it, and turning from the bare outline given in Lempriere, the Bud, to the pages of Ovid or Virgil, in which it was told at length, with all the beauty of their verse, he found more charm and meaning in it than he had at first recognised. It flowers beneath his sight. He followed it up through the different writers that had touched it, and found the pursuit full of interest and pleasure. It seemed he flew the way so easy was. Line 69. At length the pursuit came to an end. The immediate interest of the story was exhausted, and he began to realise what it had to tell him with regard to his poetical ambitions. The story transformed itself into a warning. Delightful as he had found it, the little investigation that he had carried out had opened his eyes to the limitations of his own knowledge, and he began to realise that he must wander far in other regions before he could hope to attain to his ideal. He felt discouraged. He had thought more than once that he was on the verge of the fulfilment of his hopes. He had encamped to take a fancied city of delight, line 143, only to meet with disappointment and failure. The verses that he had written could not, even in his own judgment, be called poetry. Yet he could not abandon hope, and as he dwelt upon the beauty of poetry in itself, the achievement of the poet loomed more and more glorious in his imagination, until there seemed to be nothing else worth living for. And, realizing that to become worthy of such achievement he must bury himself in a course of earnest and prolonged study, he resolved to enter upon it forthwith. "Oh, for 10 years," cried Keats in another place, "that I may overwhelm myself in poetry, so I may do the deed that my own soul has to itself decreed." Footnote from Sleep and Poetry, line 96. End footnote. The Journey Underground. The rest of this book is concerned with Endymion's adventures underground, and it may be noted at the outset, as bearing upon the interpretation that has been suggested, that the region through which he passes is one from which all human life has departed. There are some remains of man's handiwork, of which the shrine, with the image of Diana, is the most striking, but the impression left is that these courts and passages have long been silent and forsaken. They are a fitting symbol of the literature of an age long gone by. There are near the opening of this part of the story a few lines which it would be hard to match as a description of classical literature as a whole. "Dark nor light the region, nor bright, nor sombre wholly, but mingled up, a gleaming melancholy, a dusky empire and its diadems, one faint eternal eventide of gems." Line 221. The imperfect and partial understanding of these old writers, which is all that is possible in these latter days, together with the unfading, clear-cut beauty of numberless passages in them, is suggested here with a skill and sureness of touch that Keats did not often attain to at this period of his work. When Tennyson tried to describe the kind of beauty that he had found in the classical poets, he used the same image. "Jewels, 5 words long, that on the stretched forefinger of all time sparkle for ever." Footnote: The Princess, Canto 2, line 355. End footnote. The pleasure that Endymion found in exploring this new region, "'twas far too strange and wonderful for sadness, sharpening by degrees his appetite to dive into the deepest," line 219, may be taken as a reminiscence of the delight with which Keats plunged into his classical studies when he had once begun to feel the fascination of them. He was at work, says Cowden Clarke, before the first school hour began, and that was at 7 o'clock. Almost all the intervening times of recreation were so devoted, and during the afternoon holidays, when all were at play, he would be in the school, almost the only one, at his Latin or French translation. The track that Endymion followed is described in some detail. We hear of a vein of gold, line 226, metal woof like Vulcan's rainbow, line 230, of silver grots or giant range of sapphire columns or fantastic bridge athwart a flood of crystal, line 237. The path leads along a track with all its lines abrupt and angular, line 228, now entering a vast antre where the monstrous roof curves hugely, line 231, now leading through winding passages, line 235, or crossing a ridge, that o'er the vast beneath towers like an ocean cliff, line 240, and the description suggests, on the one hand, the qualities that are characteristic of ancient classical poetry as contrasted with that of the modern romantic school, the severity, the colder, harder kind of beauty, and on the other, the great variety of interest and outlook to be met with as one passes from one to another of the great writers of Greece and Rome. The Orbed Diamond. A little later Endymion came in sight of an orbed diamond, set to fray old darkness from his throne. 'Twas like the sun uprisen o'er chaos, line 245, and the amazement that he felt in looking at it, so great that his bosom grew chilly and numb, line 243, reminds us of the feelings attributed to Cortes and his men, who looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent, upon a peak in Darien, and probably refers to the same experience when Keats first looked into Chapman's Homer, and this interpretation is confirmed by the suggestion that the words carry of a light set to shine in a region that was all dark before. It is at this point, indeed, that Keats gives us a plain intimation of the meaning of the story, for he tells us that the wonders of this region are past the wit of any spirit to tell, but one of those who, when this planet's sphering time doth close, will be its high remembrances. Who they? The mighty ones who have made eternal day for Greece and England. Line 249. The Temple. Endymion now came to a temple, so complete and true in sacred custom that he well nigh feared to search it inwards. Line 257. With feelings of awe he approached and looked down sidelong aisles and into niches old, line 264, and then began to thread all courts and passages, where silence dead, roused by his whispering footsteps, murmured faint, and long he traversed to and fro, to acquaint himself with every mystery and awe, line 266. It seems likely that in the description of the minute and careful way in which Endymion examined this temple, Keats has embodied his recollections of his own study of Virgil's Aeneid. Footnote: Colvin, Life of Keats, page 184, takes the latter part of this description to refer to some other building than the temple in which stands the image of Diana, but it seems better to regard the whole passage, down to line 270, as relating to the same temple. The fair shrine beyond which stands the quivered Diana is in the chief hall of the temple, Book 1, line 298. Endymion first sees this through a long pillared vista, line 260, so that the temple is not a small building, and the other aisles and courts and passages may be naturally taken as forming part of it. End footnote. Cowden Clarke tells us that he was so fascinated with this epic that before leaving school he had voluntarily translated in writing a considerable portion of it. Nor did his apprenticeship to Mr. Hammond lessen his enthusiasm, for, at Edmonton, he plunged back into his school occupations of reading and translating whenever he could spare the time. He finished, at this time, his prose version of the Aeneid, and the recollection must have been a pleasant one to have inspired such lines as those italicised above. One would have to seek far to find such a perfect description of the sensations aroused as one makes one's way with wonder and admiration through this great poem of days long gone by. At length Endymion grew wearied, and sat down before the maw of a wide outlet to think about what he had seen. There, where new wonders ceased to float before, and thoughts of self came on, how crude and sore the journey homeward to habitual self! Line 274. If one tries to enter into the feelings of Keats when he had completed his translation of the Aeneid, one can well imagine that he had become conscious of a new standard of poetical expression. He had begun to realise, as he had never done before, what a value belonged to the choice of the mot juste. He had felt all the charm of the Muses often flowering in a lonely word. And he realised, painfully, how far his own attempts fell short of this standard. His verses would, indeed, seem crude. His recognition of his own limitations might well make him feel sore. His aspirations for poetic fame appeared a mad pursuing of the fog-born elf whose flitting lantern through rude nettle-briar cheats us into a swamp, into a fire. Line 277. But soon another feeling became more prominent. He was oppressed by the loneliness of the place and the deadness of his surroundings. He longed to see the sky, the rivers, the flowers, and the grass. He was cut off from all these things. He was in a region from which all life had departed, and the work to which he felt himself called could not be accomplished in such a place. "No," exclaimed he, "why should I tarry here?" "No," loudly echoed times innumerable. Line 295. For the Romantic poets, great as was their admiration for the true classics, felt that they had to speak out a living message to a living world, and that no mere imitation of the methods of a bygone age could accomplish this. So he returned into the temple, and reaching the shrine of Diana, prayed to her that as she does not waste her loveliness in dismal elements, line 312, so he may be delivered from the rapacious deep and brought to where he can once more hear the linnet's note, line 322. And in this passionate cry we may recognise a feeling in the mind of Keats that, greatly as these works that he had been studying were to be admired for their perfection of form, their brilliancy of expression, and their variety of interest, yet they belonged to another age, another race of men, and were lacking in fresh and living significance for the world of his day. But, as in answer to the prayer of Endymion, there sprang up through the marble floor of the temple a growth of leaves and flowers. Nor in one spot alone, the floral pride in a long whispering birth enchanted grew before his footsteps. Line 345. So Keats came to realise that the eternal principles of life might even yet find expression through the seemingly dead pages of these poets of a bygone age. Cheered by this assurance, which would remind him of the occasion when the first revelation of divine beauty was vouchsafed to him, line 554 and following, Endymion started off once more, increasing still in heart and pleasant sense. Line 351. Before long he caught the sound of music, and he was deeply stirred. It was a hopeful sign, and showed that his ear must now be more finely attuned to the melodies of heaven. For when this same supernatural music had before broken, in smoothest echoes through copse-clad valleys, line 119, it was only the children, the heralds of the coming day, who were given power to hear it. So entranced was he by the music that it was only through the leading of a heavenly guide benignant that he passed safely through the thousand mazes, till, at last, with sudden step he came upon a chamber, myrtle-walled, embowered high. Line 388. Where lay Adonis, sleeping, guarded by Cupids. Venus and Adonis. Endymion, though a wanderer from upper day, is welcomed, and is feasted with wine and fruit and manna, while there is told to him the story of the passion of Venus for Adonis, of the fate that befell him, and of the decree by which his death, medicined to a lengthy drowsiness, was changed each summer time to life. Soon Venus herself comes down, and after speaking words of encouragement to Endymion, carries Adonis away with her. So ends this episode. It represents the fulfilment of the promise of the life that was to be discovered in these old legends. Keats is still trying, by means of images, to symbolize the abstractions working in his mind, but the meaning of the images here is not obscure. He is telling us how, after he had first recognized that there was something more in his old legends than the dead perfection of an obsolete poetry, one of them at least blossomed out richly and filled him with delight, and while the revelation lasted, while a sense of the living truth embodied in the story was full upon him, the world of classic poetry no longer seemed dim and lonely. It was full of warmth and light and music and meaning. As Sir Sidney Colvin has remarked, to rescue the mind of England from this mode of deadness was part of the work of the poetical revival of 1800 and onwards, and Keats was the poet who has contributed most to the task. It was his gift to make live by imagination, whether in few words or in many, every ancient fable that came up in his mind. He could follow out a classic myth from a mere hint to its recesses, and find the human beauty and tenderness that lurk there. At length the inspiration passed. The earth closed, gave a solitary moan, and left him once again in twilight lone. Line 586. Endymion was greatly cheered by what he had seen. He felt assured of happy times when all he had endured would seem a feather to the mighty prize, so with unusual gladness on he hies. Line 590. And in these words we may take it that Keats is recalling the feeling of encouragement and pleasure with which, after the revelation that he has pictured for us above, he turned again to the study of the classics with a fuller assurance that he would gain from them guidance and inspiration for his poetical work. The path that he follows is described by images similar to those in which the earlier part of the underground journey is set before us. He passes through caves and palaces of mottled ore, gold dome, and crystal wall and turquoise floor, black polished porticos of awful shade, and at the last a diamond balustrade. Line 594. And the suggestion, as before, is that of a great and wonderful beauty, but a beauty that is hard and cold and without life, such as is usually felt to be the characteristic of the greater part of classical poetry. The magic fountains. But now Endymion comes upon a new marvel. The path which he is following brings him just above the silvery heads of 1,000 fountains, so that he could dash the waters with his spear, but at the splash, done heedlessly, those spouting columns rose sudden a poplar's height, and 'gan to enclose his diamond path with fretwork streaming round alive. Line 603. Endymion dwelt long on the strangeness of the scene, and the detail with which it is described suggests that he gave to it the same close attention as he had previously devoted to the temple which he had reached in the earlier part of his wanderings. The whole description may at first appear fantastic in the extreme, but, following the clue that has led us to this point, we recognise that Keats is telling us how, after his study of Virgil, he went on to make himself thoroughly acquainted with the poems of Ovid, more especially with the Metamorphoses. Every minute's space, so the description runs, the streams with changed magic interlace, sometimes like delicatest lattices covered with crystal vines, then weeping trees, moving about as in a gentle wind, which in a wink, to watery gauze refined, poured into shapes of curtain canopies, spangled, and rich with liquid broideries of flowers, peacocks, swans, and naiads fair. Swifter than lightning went these wonders rare. And then the water, into stubborn streams collecting, mimicked the wrought oaken beams, pillars and frieze, and high fantastic roof of those dusk places in times far aloof, cathedrals called. Line 613. Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was from Ovid's Metamorphoses, says Colvin, as Englished by that excellent Jacobean translator, George Sandys, that Keats, more than from any other source, made himself familiar with the details of classic fable. Evidences of this are strewn freely over the pages of Endymion. The scene of the sleep of Adonis and the coming of Venus to awake him is drawn from the 10th book of the Metamorphoses. The description of Cybele, lines 639 to 649, is imitated from a passage in the same book, where Venus is represented as telling to Adonis the story of Atalanta. The pursuit of Arethusa by Alpheus, line 916, comes from the 5th book, and that of Glaucus and Scylla, book 3, is given in the 13th and 24th books. This free use of Ovid, added to the emphasis which is laid throughout this passage on the alterations that are taking place in the form and significance of the magic fountains, leaves little room for doubt as to the meaning of the poet. He may have thought that in making use of the expressions changed magic, line 613, and founts protean, line 627, he was giving a sufficiently broad hint of his purpose. Cybele. Bidding farewell to these sights, Endymion passes on, and soon sees the vision of Cybele, to which allusion has already been made. Cybele, wife of Cronos and mother of the gods, may be taken to represent the fount and source of all these legends, in which the poet is now beginning to perceive a deeper meaning, and he has this brief glimpse of her shortly before his wanderings in the region of classical poetry are crowned with their great reward. For, at this point, he finds that the diamond path that he has been following ends abruptly in mid-air. In his perplexity, Endymion asks for divine help, and there comes to him a large eagle on which he flings himself and is borne down through unknown things, till exhaled asphodel and rose, with spicy fannings interbreathed, came swelling forth. Line 663. Diana. The eagle lands him in the greenest nook of a jasmine bower, all bestrown with golden moss. He wanders through verdant cave and cell, and feels a swell of sudden exultation. An intense longing for his heavenly love comes upon him. He knows, however, that no passionate striving of spirit will bring her to him, and yielding quietly to the influences by which he feels himself to be surrounded, suddenly he finds that she is with him. Even now he does not realize the full measure of the glory that is his, but the period of their intercourse is more prolonged, more intimate, and more complete than ever it has been before. This is the climax of the second book, and it is evidently intended to set forth, by means of picture and imagery, some part of the experience through which the poet passed in the course of his efforts to attain to the understanding of the innermost mysteries of poetry. We may regard him as telling us, in the course of this book, of some incident that awakened his interest in classical poetry, and that led to his plunging into a deep and thorough study of certain parts of it, more especially the Aeneid of Virgil and the Metamorphoses of Ovid, of the curiosity and interest which the study aroused in him, of the discouragement that came upon him as he reflected that this was the expression of the mind of an age that had long passed away, whose aim in life and mode of thought and manner of speech seemed to have little or no meaning for the men and women of his day, of the wonder and delight which he felt when, as by a revelation, he became aware of a deeper and richer meaning that lay beneath the surface of these old myths and legends, and then how he reached a point where it seemed to him that classical poetry had done for him all that it could do in the way of leading him to the ideal that he was seeking. It was at this time, when all the course of painful striving through which he had gone seemed to have led to no tangible result, that there came to him an inspiration, as from some divine source, which carried him right into the very presence of the spirit of perfect poetry. And this mood of exaltation and attainment lasted longer and was more complete than ever before. And though he knew, even while the mood was upon him, that it could not endure, but would die away after a time, yet he felt cheered and encouraged, for he knew that he was coming nearer and nearer to the realization of the full powers, the high ideal, towards which he was striving. This appears to be the meaning, as far as one has been able to trace it, that Keats intended to convey in this book, and while we may feel that the climax is told in a manner not worthy of the loftiness of the experience that it is intended to represent, we must at the same time recognise that it reveals something of the earnestness and intensity with which Keats pursued his aims and ideals. The pleasure that comes from the exercise of the creative instinct is shared by many. The child who draws the picture of a cow or carves his little boat of bark knows something of it. The man who lays out a garden or designs a house shares in it. The writer of verse, that others can only read with a smile, has felt some thrill of pleasure in the making of it. For which of us can hope to enter into the joy of the poet who has produced a masterpiece able to stir thousands of hearts by its subtle magic? Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Or, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. This is the level of attainment, with the rapture that must belong to it, that Keats has attempted to depict for us in this book. Endymion, awaking out of his great experience, finds that he is alone. He feels sad and forlorn, but no longer resentful, as he had been on former occasions when these wonderful visitations had passed. He sat down in a marvellous grotto and thought over the story of his life, and coming down to this latest experience, he began to wonder what he still had to endure before he could come to the full realization of his hopes. As he pondered, he heard a noise, and soon, on either side outgushed, with misty spray, a copious spring, and both together dashed swift, mad, fantastic round the rocks. Line 918. Alpheus and Arethusa. It was Alpheus in pursuit of Arethusa. She longs to yield, but fears the wrath of Diana, and Endymion, moved with a fellow feeling of pity for their longings unfulfilled, prays to a still unknown goddess to have compassion on them and make them happy. Then, turning, he moved along a sandy path and found that the visions of the earth were gone and fled. He saw the giant sea above his head. Line 1022. The significance of this incident, with which the second book closes, appears to be twofold. It is, in the first place, a fresh illustration of the life and power that may be found in these old stories for those who have sympathy and insight to enter into their spirit. And there is further the suggestion, preparing the way for one aspect of what is to follow in the next book, that Endymion is coming to be less absorbed in his own perplexities and troubles, and is learning to look with a feeling of sympathy upon the difficulties of others, and this marks an important advance in the process of his training. The introduction to the second book. If we now turn to the lines that form the introduction to this book, we find that they bear out the interpretation to which the study of the rest of the book has led us. The essence of them is contained in the first 7 lines, and the remainder of the passage is merely expansion and illustration of the one idea stated at the beginning. O sovereign power of love! O grief! O balm! All records, saving thine, come cool and calm and shadowy through the mist of past years. For others, good or bad, hatred and tears have become indolent. But touching thine, one sigh doth echo, one poor sob doth pine, one kiss brings honeydew from buried days. Line 1. And he goes on to say that the tale of the wars around Troy, or of the campaigns of Alexander, has little power to move us, while our souls thrill with responsive sympathy when we hear such stories as those of Troilus and Cressida, or of Imogen. So, it will be remembered, a large part of classical poetry is imaged as cold and lifeless. Its beauty is like that of the diamond or sapphire, but where it enshrines the passion of love, it pulsates with life. Such stories as those of Venus and Adonis, or of the river lovers, still retain their power to rouse our sympathy. More than the experience of Keats. In working out the interpretation of this book, it has been convenient to deal with it primarily as a record of the personal experience of Keats. But here, no less than in the first book, it is necessary to bear in mind that the allegory has a wider significance and is intended to represent the process of training which may be regarded as desirable, if not necessary, for anyone who aspires to the name of poet. It is evident that the journey of Endymion suggests a much more extensive study of classical literature than Keats ever had the opportunity of carrying out. He did indeed come to know Homer with as much completeness as the translation of Chapman made possible. He studied Ovid both with the help of Sandys and in the original text, while, as noted above, he translated the whole of the Aeneid for himself. But beyond this, his knowledge of the classics appears to have been derived from such secondary sources as Tuke's Pantheon, Lempriere's Classical Dictionary, and Spencer's Polymatus. He was fully conscious, however, of the disadvantages of the limited range of his own knowledge, and accordingly, in describing Endymion's wanderings through the dusky empire with its diadems, he suggests a much wider range of study, though the sketch is naturally coloured by reminiscences of what he knew best. End of section. Section 3 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3. The Story of Glaucus and Scylla. The third book is mainly concerned with the story of Glaucus and Scylla. It tells how Glaucus, having won the power of living in the sea, saw and loved Scylla, line 399, and tried to win her, but, tiring of the pursuit, turned aside and yielded to the wiles of Circe, line 418. After a time he awoke to a sense of his degradation, and was condemned to impotence for a long space of time, while Scylla appeared to be dead, line 619. During this time he was witness of a shipwreck. One of the men from the ship, being carried by the sea towards Glaucus, thrust a scroll into his hand, but fell back and perished with the rest, line 674. On the scroll Glaucus found a message that gave him hope of deliverance. When Endymion, in the course of his wanderings, met Glaucus, the old man hailed him joyfully and claimed his help, line 234. By rightful use of the magic scroll, Glaucus was restored to youthful energy, and Scylla was revived, line 780, while those of the dead, whose bodies had been carefully laid aside by Glaucus during the period of his punishment, were restored to life, and all went in joyful procession to the hall of Neptune, line 868. There, after the singing of a hymn to the god, a vision of Oceanus was seen, line 994. Endymion fell senseless, but in his swoon received the promise of Diana that he should soon be raised to immortality. When he awoke, he found himself in a cool forest beside a placid lake. Representing a poetical movement. We have found that in the first book of this poem, the underlying meaning, so far as one can trace it, appears to be concerned, in the earlier part of the book, With the new movement that made itself felt in the realm of English poetry from the middle of the 18th century, while in the latter part of the first and throughout the second book we are told of the experiences through which a poet might pass as he came under the influence of such a movement and strove to realise its ideals in his own work. In the third book it seems that the more individual aspect of the story retires into the background for a time, and we are again chiefly concerned with the larger movements of English poetry. There is, as in the last book, an introductory passage of about 40 lines, the significance of which may be more suitably considered when the meaning of the main theme of the book has been dealt with. But after this there is a further passage, to line 187, that intervenes before the story really moves on its way again, lines that are mainly devoted to praise of the beauty and influence of the moon. Endymion's love for the moon. We are told of the gentle and far-reaching nature of this influence. Thou dost bless everywhere with silver lip, kissing dead things to life. Line 56. Thy benediction passeth not one obscure hiding place, one little spot where pleasure may be sent. She is shining now, though with but a pale light, upon Endymion in his wanderings. Thy cheek is pale, for one whose cheek is pale. Thou dost bewail his tears who weeps for thee. Line 75. Endymion's love for Diana. But even these faint beams have power to warm the heart of Endymion, and to comfort him in his solitude. Endymion wonders at the power that she exercises. It had pervaded all the occupations of his previous life, and as he grew up it still blended with all his ardours. Line 160. Then his strange love came, and the influence of the moon grew less. She came, and thou didst fade and fade away, yet not entirely. No, thy starry sway has been an under-passion to this hour. Line 177. He is torn between the attraction of the two. Dearest love, forgive that I can think away from thee and live. Pardon me, airy planet, that I prize one thought beyond thine argent luxuries. Line 183. And it is, of course, obvious that he does not recognise the identity of the two. The meaning of the contrast. It can hardly be doubted, if we keep in view the general purpose of the poem and the length at which this matter is treated, that we have here something of significance in relation to the work of the poet, some aspect of poetic theory that Keats felt to be of importance. It is, of course, true that Keats had been, from childhood, passionately fond of moonlight, and this fact no doubt influenced the tone of the passage and may, indeed, have given rise to it. But it says more than this, and one may find a clue to the further meaning in the repeated failure of Endymion to recognise the identity of his heavenly visitant with the moon, whose beauty affected him so powerfully. And starting with this as a guide, we may interpret the passage somewhat in this way. Footnote. This point occurs in each of the 4 books. When Endymion sees the vision for the first time, he is watching the moon and is fascinated by her beauty. Book 1, line 591. She disappears behind a cloud, line 597, and then the goddess appears, line 602, but he does not connect the two. Again, before he begins his wanderings underground, the beauty of the moon fills him with delight and longing, but so little is he conscious of her identity that he begs her to point out his love's far dwelling. Book 2, line 178. In the 4th book, the situation has grown even more complex because of the appearance of Diana in a new form, and the perplexity arising from his failure to perceive her identity is greater than ever. Book 4, lines 429, 438, 497, and line 95. End footnote. Cynthia, the moon, stands for that element in the attractiveness of poetry which depends upon beauty of form. It is, indeed, an influence as widespread as life itself. There is a rhythm in the growth of the flowers, in the song of the birds, in the movement of the rivers and the tides, and it is, of course, a large part of the very essence of poetry. But poetry must also express feeling and passion, though the moving power of passion will visit the poet less frequently, will be less constantly present as a force, than the gentler and milder influence of beauty in form. Yet, if the poet is to reach any high level of attainment, he must come to recognise that these two, different as their appearance may be, are not to be finally separated. When the poet, in moments of greatest achievement, attains his ideal, he finds not merely that beauty of expression and beauty of feeling are both present, but that they can no longer be distinguished from one another. In the white heat of the finest inspiration he learns that they are one. Footnote. Compare what Mr. A. C. Bradley says in his famous lecture, Poetry for Poetry's Sake. The value of versification, when it is indissolubly fused with meaning, can hardly be exaggerated. The gift for feeling it, even more, perhaps, than the gift for feeling the value of style, is the specific gift for poetry, as distinguished from other arts. But versification, taken as far as possible, all by itself, has a very different worth. Some aesthetic worth it has. How much, you may experience by reading poetry in a language of which you do not understand a syllable. The pleasure is quite appreciable, but it is not great. Nor in actual poetic experience do you meet with it as such at all. For, I repeat, it is not added to the pleasure of the meaning when you read poetry that you do understand. By some mystery, the music is then the music of the meaning, and the two are one. Oxford Lectures on Poetry, page 21. End footnote. Ocean Relics. Meanwhile Endymion has been wandering in the depths of ocean. He has passed many relics of former days. Old rusted anchors, helmets, breastplates large of gone sea warriors, brazen beaks and targe, rudders that for 100 years had lost the sway of human hand. Line 123. And these things give him a feeling of depression which is only removed by the soothing influence of the moon. The passage based upon Shakespeare. The passage, as is well known, is based upon the account given by Clarence of one part of his dream, and Geoffrey's remark upon it is worth remembering. It comes of no ignoble lineage, nor shames its high descent. Footnote. Methought I saw 1,000 fearful wrecks, 10,000 men that fishers gnawed upon, wedges of gold, great anchors, heaps of pearl, inestimable stones, unvalued jewels, all scattered in the bottom of the sea. Some lay in dead men's skulls, and in those holes, where eyes did once inhabit, there were crept, as 'twere in scorn of eyes, reflecting gems, which wooed the slimy bottom of the deep, and mocked the dead bones that lay scattered by. King Richard III, Act 1, Scene 4. End footnote. This is well put, but it falls short of the truth, for in these lines Keats has rehandled the lines from Shakespeare with so much skill and imaginative power that they surpass the material of which they were built. But for our present purpose it is more to the point to see if we can define the character of the changes that Keats has introduced, for in this way we have the best hope of getting upon the track of his purpose. It will be seen, on comparing the two passages, that Keats has throughout laid stress on the antiquity of the remains which Endymion found on the sea bottom, while Shakespeare does not refer at all to this aspect of them. Thus the great anchors of Clarence's dream become old rusted anchors, wedges of gold are transformed into gold vase embossed with long forgotten story, and several things not found in the earlier passage, such as the mouldering scrolls writ in the tongue of heaven by those souls who first were on the earth, are introduced, all emphasizing the same point. Some men would have delighted to examine these relics, but it was not so with Endymion. A cold leaden awe these secrets struck into him, and unless Diana had chased away that heaviness, he might have died. Line 136. What Keats appears to have in mind is that the study of old things merely because they are old is not an inspiring pursuit for a poet. Antiquarianism, as he may have met with in the pages of Strutt or of Ritson, only depresses the spirit of poetry, and may even kill it if a higher inspiration does not come to keep it alive. That Keats did not undervalue the imaginative treatment of stories of olden days is abundantly clear, but for one who could do this with the genius of Scott, there were scores who would be dull and wearisome, and the poet hurried from them to seek fresh inspiration elsewhere. Glaucus. At length, as he lifted up his eyes, he saw, far in the concave green of the sea, an old man sitting calm and peacefully. Line 191. This was Glaucus, whose story fills the greater part of this book, for though Endymion plays an important part in the development of events, the interest attaching to his actions is for the time subordinate, while Glaucus and his past history take the most prominent place. Glaucus's story. The story of Glaucus, as he told it to Endymion, lines 318 and following, offers in its early stages some points of similarity to that of Endymion himself. He was a fisherman, and he delighted in his life upon the sea. He felt the same craving as Endymion had felt for quietness and meditation and communion with nature. The crown of all my life was utmost quietude. More did I love to lie in cavern rude, keeping in wait whole days for Neptune's voice, and if it came at last, hark and rejoice. Line 352. And he so far achieved his desire that he found himself able to live and move freely in the depths of the ocean. Its meaning. It is not until we reach a later part of the story of Glaucus that we meet with any very clear indications of its allegorical meaning, but it may be worth while to point out at once what appears to be the true line of interpretation, making use by anticipation of clues that will be found further on. The story of Endymion, as we have seen, represents in one aspect the growth of the new spirit which was making itself felt in English poetry before the time of Keats, and which found its fulfilment in what we know as the New Romantic movement. It is this more general side of his theme that the poet appears to be dealing with in the third book, the more individual and personal aspect of it being dropped for the time. A new poetic movement. Just as Endymion represents the poetic spirit which was animating the age of Keats, so Glaucus, in his youth, may be regarded as representing a different poetic spirit, animating an earlier age. Footnote. It does not appear necessary to take the 1,000 years, line 326, in a literal sense. End footnote. His loneliness, his longing for utmost quietude, his desire to be free of Neptune's kingdom, line 377, his entrance into this new life, his passion for and pursuit of Scylla, all these early experiences, corresponding largely to those through which Endymion passed, represent the yearnings, the idealisms, and the tentative efforts which belong to the development of a new movement, and while the details vary, the general course that it follows is much the same in one age as in another. Such a movement, for example, was that which had for its aim the attainment of correctness of style and polish of form in the days of Waller and his contemporaries, and those who kept that ideal before them no doubt strove with no less earnestness and sincerity to reach it than the poets of a later age strove after the different ideals that seemed to them so much loftier. We are told clearly about the earnestness and eagerness of the pursuit. My passion grew the more I saw her dainty hue gleam delicately through the azure clear, until 'twas too fierce agony to bear. Line 407. the failure. But from this point his story ceases to resemble that of Endymion, for, impatient at his want of success in attaining his ideal, Glaucus turned aside to seek help from Circe, and under the influence of her baleful charms allowed himself to be seduced from his aim, to forget his high ideal, and to follow an unworthy and degrading course of life. After a time he came to himself and saw in her true light the witch to whose charms he had surrendered. He watched her as she exercised her evil influence upon those around her. Wizard and brute, laughing and wailing, grovelling, serpentinging, showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag and sting. Oh, such deformities! Line 500. Until he was filled with remorse. But it was too late. He had incurred the fierce displeasure of the goddess and was condemned to an age-long decrepitude. He plunged once more into the ocean, only to discover that Scylla was dead, slain by the hated power of Circe. And as for himself, it was not long before his limbs became gaunt, withered, sapless, feeble, cramped, and lame. Line 637. If we now attempt to follow up the clue which has guided us thus far, it would appear that we must look for some critical phase in the development of English poetry where, in the view of Keats, things took a disastrous course, where poetry had turned aside from its nobler aims, became unfaithful to its lofty ideals, and falling under influences which, though superficially attractive, were essentially mean and base, was reduced to a state of decrepitude. And it is not difficult to put one's finger upon the period when, in the opinion of Keats, a change of this nature had come over English poetry. He regarded the spirit that became dominant after the Restoration as a spirit of unfaithfulness to the true ideals of poetry. He hated, says Sir Sidney Colvin, the whole Augustan and post-Augustan tribe of social and moral essayists in verse, and Pope, their illustrious master, most of all. His feeling was, of course, shared by other poets of the time. There is a passage in an essay of Wordsworth's, which had appeared not long before Keats began to write Endymion, in which Pope and his school are described in terms that Keats would have heartily endorsed, and one may almost suspect that the younger poet is merely translating into the picturesque imagery of his poem what the elder one has expressed in direct criticism. Wordsworth on Pope. The passage reads as follows: "The arts by which Pope, soon afterwards, contrived to procure to himself a more general and a higher reputation than perhaps any English poet ever attained during his lifetime, are known to the judicious, and as well known is it to them that the undue exertion of these arts is the cause why Pope has for some time held a rank in literature from which, if he had not been seduced by an over-love of immediate popularity, and had confided more in his native genius, he never could have descended. He bewitched the nation by his melody, and dazzled it by his polished style, and was himself blinded by his own success. Having wandered from humanity in his eclogues with boyish inexperience, the praise which these compositions obtained tempted him into the belief that nature was not to be trusted, at least in pastoral poetry. To prove this by example, he put his friend Gay upon writing those eclogues which the author intended to be burlesque. The instigator of the work and his admirers could perceive in them nothing but what was ridiculous. Nevertheless, though these poems contain some detestable passages, the effect, as Dr. Johnson well observes, of reality and truth become conspicuous even when the intention was to show them grovelling and degraded. Keats on the Classical School. In Sleep and Poetry, which had appeared only a few months before Keats wrote the passage now under consideration, he had expressed his feelings on this matter in no uncertain way. After speaking with enthusiasm of the work of the poets of the Elizabethan age, when the Muses were well nigh cloyed with honours, he goes on to ask, could all this be forgotten? And the answer is, yes, A schism nurtured by foppery and barbarism made great Apollo blush for this his land. He speaks of them as dead to things they knew not of, and finally denounces them as an ill-fated, impious race, that blasphemed the bright lyrist to his face and did not know it. No, they went about holding a poor decrepit standard out, marked with most flimsy mottos, and in large the name of one Boileau. Book 2, line 181 and following. The very expressions of which Keats makes use in this passage suggest in a striking way its relation with this part of the story of Glaucus. While under the spell of Circe he was dead to the beauty of Scylla, he had been guilty of impiety in deserting the nobler ideal for the baser. He was certainly ill-fated, and the word decrepit would apply more exactly to him, as described in the story, than to the standard of the school of Pope. We may take it then that Keats is in this passage describing to us in picturesque form what he regarded as the tragical history of English poetry after the Restoration. He shows us how it was ready for a fresh adventure, and how, when a new and beautiful ideal was in sight, it had allowed itself to be turned aside from its high aims, and had abandoned itself to the pursuit of false pleasures, a course that resulted in a long period of hopeless futility. The ideal had, to all appearance, perished. Such was certainly his view of the course of poetry in that period, and it would appear that this is the real meaning of the story of Glaucus. What Circe stands for. It seems, indeed, that Keats, not content with drawing this unflattering picture of the general tendency and influence of the school of poetry for which he felt such a hearty dislike, has, in the figure of Circe, sketched a portrait, or perhaps one should say a caricature, of no less a person than its distinguished head and chief, Pope himself. This is suggested by certain resemblances between the expressions which Wordsworth applies to Pope in the passage quoted above, and the account of Circe in the poem. Footnote. Note, for instance, the arts by which Pope contrived, the undue exertion of these arts, and compare what is said of Gay's eclogues. The instigator of the work, Pope, could perceive in them nothing but what was ridiculous, with line 509. Oft times, upon the sudden, she laughed out. End footnote. It is confirmed by the description of those who surrounded Circe as showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag, and sting. Line 502. Words that aptly represent the tribe of petty and malicious satirists that basked in the sunshine of Pope's favours, or, more often, writhed under his lash. But the passage that appears to leave little, if any, room for doubt as to the intention of Keats occurs a little further down in the description of the same incident. Avenging, slow, anon she took a branch of mistletoe, and emptied on't a black dull gurgling phial. Groaned one and all, as if some piercing trial were sharpening for their pitiable bones. She lifted up the charm. Appealing groans from their poor breasts went suing to her ear in vain. Remorseless as an infant's bier, she wished against their eyes the sooty oil, whereat was heard a noise of painful toil, increasing gradual to a tempest rage, shrieks, yells, and groans of torture pilgrimage, until their grieved bodies 'gan to bloat and puff from the tail's end to stifled throat. Then was appalling silence. Then a sight more wildering than all that horse affright. For the whole herd, as by a whirlwind writhen, went through the dismal air like one huge python antagonizing Boreas, and so vanished. Yet there was not a breath of wind. She banished these phantoms with a nod. Line 513. The Dunciad. One can hardly fail to recognise in these lines a picture, drawn with no small degree of humour and skill, of the treatment meted out by Pope to the petty scribblers of his day in the pages of the Dunciad. the merciless spirit in which the punishment was administered, the shrieks and yells and groans that it produced, and the entire disappearance of the victims from the literary stage are excellently depicted. Horneck, Roome, Jacob, Good. Who would ever hear their names today unless he reads the lines in which they received their castigation? Pope, indeed, banished these phantoms with a nod. The words avenging, slow, with which the passage referring to the Dunciad opens, may or may not have been chosen with reference to that poem, but they apply to it more exactly than they do to the Circe of classical legend. In the preface to the first edition, 1728, Pope indicates that his purpose is to avenge himself upon his enemies. I will only observe as a fact that every week for these 2 months past the town has been persecuted with pamphlets, advertisements, letters, and weekly essays, not only against the wit and writings, but against the character and person of Mr. Pope, while as for the slowness, the same preface speaks of it as having been the labour of full 6 years of his life. The story of the rescued scroll. An incident that is related a little further on in the story of Glaucus appears to carry a meaning that confirms the line of interpretation that has been given to the preceding part of the poem. After Glaucus has passed a long time in the state of decrepitude to which he had been reduced by Circe, he was one day sitting on a rock that stood out above the spray when he saw a vessel approach. A storm arose, the vessel was wrecked before his eyes. The feebleness to which he had been reduced made of no avail his eager desire to save those who were drowning, and he saw one after another sink helpless into the deep. While he was still watching, there emerged from the waves an old man's hand, holding out a scroll and a wand. Glaucus seized these treasures, and even touched the hand that held them, but it slipped from his grasp and sank. The storm abated, and the sun shone again. I was athirst to search the book, and in the warming air parted its dripping leaves with eager care. Strange matters did it treat of, and drew on my soul, page after page, till well nigh won into forgetfulness. Line 676. And, above all, he found, to his great joy, that the book contained the promise of his ultimate deliverance, for it spoke of a youth, by heavenly power loved and led, who should stand before him and who was to be told how to bring about the redemption of Glaucus from the punishment to which he had been condemned. And it was added, "The youth elect must do the thing, or both will be destroyed." Line 710. A redeeming influence. To interpret rightly the significance of this incident in relation to the meaning of the book as a whole, we must look for some influence that gave promise of new life to English poetry after the period of decrepitude which was the penalty of yielding to the influence of Pope. It may be well to note in passing that we are not concerned with the justice or injustice of such a method of representing this school of poetry. Whether it is to be regarded as fair, though severe, satire, or an unfair caricature, is a matter outside our present inquiry. There is no doubt as to the views of Keats on the point, and the interpretation here suggested corresponds with those views. It is, however, generally agreed that the influences which brought about a change of spirit in English poetry are represented most completely in the revival of interest in the ballad, and that Bishop Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry at once expressed and stimulated this interest in the most effective manner. Wordsworth, in the essay to which reference has already been made, speaks with great enthusiasm of Percy's work, and after pointing out the influence that it had exerted on the revival of poetry in Germany, adds, "For our own country its poetry has been absolutely redeemed by it." Footnote: Prose Works of William Wordsworth, edited by Knight, Volume 2, page 247. It is worth noting that in September 1817, when Keats was writing this third book of Endymion, he was staying at Oxford with his friend Bailey, and his letters record that they had been reading Wordsworth together. See Letter to Reynolds, 21st of September 1817. In a letter written to Bailey a little later, November 1817, he refers again to Wordsworth. End footnote. The correspondence between this expression of Wordsworth's and the story as shaped by Keats is so striking that one can hardly suppose it to be accidental, especially when taken in conjunction with the parallelism previously noted between essay and poem, and it is not unlikely that in this sentence we have the germ out of which the incident originally grew in the mind of Keats. The history of the ballads. When we come to examine the details of the incident, their correspondence with the history of the ballads becomes evident. He tells us, in words which seem carefully adapted to the meaning underlying the surface, that the crew had gone, by one and one, to pale oblivion, line 665. And even the one whose hand, emerging, held up the scroll that Glaucus safely grasped, was not himself rescued, but sank again and disappeared. This corresponds exactly with the fate that has overtaken the makers of the ballads. Some fragments of their work have been rescued from destruction, but they themselves have all sunk down into oblivion. Not even their names have survived, nor is it known who gathered together the ballads that Percy found in the famous scroll that he rescued only by a hair's breadth from destruction. Yet, if only the lovers of poetry had stirred themselves earlier, how much more might have been rescued. It was not till the publication of Allan Ramsay's Evergreen and Tea Table Miscellany and Bishop Percy's Relics, 1765, says Mr. Andrew Lang, that a serious effort was made to recover Scottish and English folk songs from the recitation of the old people who still knew them by heart. And when we ask why the effort was not made earlier, the answer that Keats puts forward was that it was due to the paralysing effect of the influence of the school of Pope. Oh, they had all been saved, but crazed eld annulled my vigorous cravings, and thus quelled and curbed, think on't, O Latmian, did I sit writhing with pity and a cursing fit against that hell-born Circe. Line 661. The interest that they aroused is described in the lines already quoted, and the story goes on to tell of the promise of redemption that was contained in the scroll, and of how this promise was fulfilled when Endymion, representing the spirit of the new poetry, scattered first upon Glaucus and then upon Scylla some of the powerful fragments of the rescued scroll, and how, under its magic influence, Glaucus was restored to his youthful vigour and beauty, and Scylla came to life again. Underneath the symbolism, we can hardly fail to recognise that Keats is representing to us the restoration of a true poetic ideal, and the infusion of fresh life and energy into poetry after its long period of futile decrepitude, and that he is emphasising the part played by the rediscovery of the ballads in bringing about this renaissance. The other details of the story, the undoing of the tangled thread, the thread which was so weak for Glaucus, but which Endymion handled safely, the reading of the shell on which Glaucus could see no sign or character, the breaking of the wand against the lyre, which was followed by some sweet and sudden music, all these are significant in different ways of the magic power immanent in the spirit of the new poetry. The task of Glaucus. It will be remembered that the same passage that gave to Glaucus the hope of ultimate redemption spoke of a task that he must undertake during the period of his bondage. All lovers tempest-tossed, and in the savage overwhelming lost, he shall deposit side by side, until time's creeping shall the dreary space fulfil. Line 703. This may be taken to represent the reverent regard that was paid to the great poets of former times, even during the period of poetical decrepitude. There is no lack of evidence on this point. Dryden, in his Preface to the Fables, for example, makes a comparison between Chaucer and Ovid which works out on the whole to the advantage of the English poet. The imitation of Spenser, sometimes in form only, at other times in a way that shows a feeling for the magic beauty of his poetry, was a frequent occupation among the minor and an occasional amusement of the major poets of this time. Footnote: Professor Phelps has an interesting chapter on this matter in The Beginnings of the English Romantic Movement, Gin, and in an appendix gives a list of 57 imitations of Spenser published between 1706 and 1775. End footnote. While Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Thomas Warton's Observations on the Fairy Queen, which appeared only 9 years after the death of Pope, illustrate the same feeling. The spirit that had animated these poets was no longer a vital force in English poetry, but the care that was taken of them was a hopeful sign for the future. When Endymion came to them he found their patient lips all ruddy, for here death no blossom nips. Line 739. That is to say, their poetry remained unspoiled, even though for the time they could not be said to exercise any living influence. But now, after renewing the youthful vigour of Glaucus and Scylla, Endymion passed on, showering those powerful fragments on the dead, and as he passed, each lifted up his head, as doth a flower at Apollo's touch. Line 784. The revival of interest in poetry which resulted from the study of the ballads spread to the works of the older poets, so that they began once more to take their place among the vital influences of the day. The music of poetry was once more heard in the land. Delicious symphonies, like airy flowers, budded and swelled, and full blown, shed full showers of light, soft unseen leaves of sounds divine. Line 798. The other host. As the host of those who had been redeemed by this magic power moved on their way to the palace of Neptune, they saw descending thick another multitude, whereat more quick moved either host. Line 820. This is probably intended to refer to the romantic movement on the continent of Europe, more particularly in France and Germany, which developed side by side with the movement in England, and to the way in which each movement stimulated the other. The festival in Neptune's palace. The closing part of the book describes the joyous celebration of this fresh renaissance held in the palace of Neptune, symbolical of the enthusiasm and delight that were aroused by the revived interest in the poetry of past ages. The general bearing of the passage seems sufficiently clear, but there are two incidents in it that require a little closer examination. Oceanus. The first of these is the appearance at the festival of a number of the more ancient gods. On oozy throne, smooth moving, came Oceanus the old, to take a latest glimpse at his sheepfold before he went into his quiet cave to muse for ever. Line 993. And with him came Doris and Nereus and Amphion, an era for Arion, and others. We cannot but call to mind the passage in the second book, lines 639 and following, where Endymion comes upon the vision of Cybele in the course of his wanderings underground. In both cases Keats appears to be suggesting that the spirit of poetry, as it found expression in the earliest efforts of mankind, is looking with benevolent regard upon this latest manifestation, differing greatly in form and expression, yet animated by the same spirit of reverence and fostered by the same divine protection as in former ages. The swooning of Endymion. The second tells of the swoon into which Endymion fell after looking upon this vision of the elder gods. The palace whirls around giddy Endymion, seeing he was there far strayed from mortality. Line 1005. He fell unconscious at the feet of Neptune and was carried away by the Nereids. It can hardly be doubted that some distinct meaning underlies this incident, and, keeping a firm hold of the clue by which we have been guided thus far, we may arrive at a reasonable interpretation of it. The salient points that must be kept in view are that it is Endymion who has played a leading part in the revival of the dead forms of those who had been tended by the care of Glaucus, and yet, when the revival is complete, and is the occasion of great rejoicing, Endymion alone is unable to bear it, and sinks into unconsciousness, notwithstanding the assurances that he has received of an early fulfilment of his desires. Bearing in mind that Endymion stands for the spirit of the new poetry, we may recognise, as has already been pointed out, that we have here sketched for us the way in which this spirit brought renewed life and significance into the study of the earlier poets. They had never ceased to be regarded with respect and admiration, but under the new influence they came to have a fresh vitality that was a source of delight and an occasion for thanksgiving. So far the path is fairly plain, and though the next stretch of it is less clearly marked, we are probably following the right track if we interpret the remaining part of the story as showing that although the spirit of the new poetry has reacted thus powerfully on the older poetry, it cannot live upon the result of this. There is hope and promise that its ideals may be fulfilled, but for the moment the very success that it has achieved in giving new life and meaning to the poetry of earlier days may tend to lessen its own vitality. Certainly it cannot flourish upon inspiration drawn merely from its predecessors. In seeking them it has strayed too far from mortality. It can only become a living force by seeking contact with the actual life of men and women, and by entering into their joys and sorrows. The way in which this is accomplished, and the ideal finally reached, will be found in the next book. The introduction to the third book. The lines that form the introduction to this book are not in Keats' happiest vein, nor do they, at first sight, appear to have much bearing on the main theme of the poem. Their most obvious reference is political, and in this sense they denounce the empty pomp of incompetent rulers who have induced submissive peoples to receive them with mistaken enthusiasm. But an examination of the phrases used makes it evident that they may bear another meaning, and indeed appear to have been chosen for that purpose. We may question the poetic fitness of such expressions as most prevailing tinsel or baaing vanities, but there can be no doubt that they effectively describe the feeling that Keats entertained for the writings of Pope and his school. He regarded them as showing not one tinge of sanctuary splendour, that is to say, they had never offered Milton's prayer that he might be from out his secret altar touched with sacred fire. And he may well have been thinking more of them than of those who had incurred Leigh Hunt's political animosity when he wrote, "With unladen breasts, save of blown self-applause, they proudly mount to their spirit's perch, their being's high account, their tip-top nothings, their dull skies, their thrones." Line 12. The contrast that he proceeds to draw describes no less clearly his feeling as to the loftier aims and ideals of the poetical movement in the midst of which he was living, when compared with those of the previous age. No, there are throne seats unscalable but by a patient wing, a constant spell, or by ethereal things that, unconfined, can make a ladder of the eternal wind, and poise about in cloudy thunder tents to watch the abysm birth of elements. Line 23. A careful reading of the whole passage makes it evident that while the political meaning is on the surface, the literary is clearly to be seen just underneath it. Moreover, while the political reference has no recognisable bearing on the matters with which the poem is concerned, the literary significance of the passage brings it into immediate relation with the meaning which we have found to underlie the story of this book. End of section. Section 4 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4. The Story. The story of the fourth book turns upon one strong situation which is presented with some degree of power. The situation arises from a new and irresistible attraction that Endymion feels for an Indian maiden, who now appears for the first time. After his sea adventures, he finds himself in a green forest near a placid lake, and there he hears a plaintive cry, line 40, which, as he discovers, comes from a beautiful Indian maiden who has failed to find solace in the revelry of Bacchus, line 268, and is longing for human affection. He is torn between the attraction he feels for her and his devotion to his heavenly love. The development of the situation thus presented is less effective, and one cannot but feel that the story has suffered for the sake of the allegory. Mercury comes down, and at a touch of his wand there springs from the earth two jet-black winged steeds, on which Endymion and the maiden fly up into the regions of the sky. Line 347. There, overcome by slumber, he dreams that he is in heaven, and wakes to find himself indeed in the presence of his divine love. Line 436. In sore perplexity he turns now to her, now to the Indian maid, and yet, in spite of all appearance, he knows in his heart that he is not unfaithful to either. At length he finds that his companion has vanished, and soon afterwards her steed plunges down to the earth. Line 512. Endymion's steed bears him to the cave of quietude, where he fails to see the guests passing on their way to Diana's wedding feast, though he seems to have heard their song. Lines 556 and 611. His steed brings him down to earth again, and there he finds his Indian love. Line 623. Now that he feels his feet once more planted on solid ground, he determines to devote himself to this earthly human love, feeling that he has been too presumptuous in aspiring to a heavenly destiny. To Endymion's dismay, she tells him that she is forbidden to accept his love. Line 752. He sits despondent on the very spot where he had first seen the vision of Diana, and while he sits there, Peona appears. Line 800. She sees his downcast look, and bids him be happy, for she will rejoice that he has found such a lovely mate. He declares that he will live a hermit's life, and that Peona alone shall visit him, but expresses a hope that the Indian maid will stay with Peona. Line 870. He bids farewell to them both, and they leave him, but he calls them back, begging them to meet him once more that evening in the grove behind great Diana's temple. Line 911. The denouement forms an effective close to the story. As the sun sinks, Endymion makes his way to the temple, thinking that surely his troubles and his life must now have an ending. The two maidens are there, but as he utters his desire that heaven's will may be declared, a wonderful change takes place. His Indian love is transformed, and he sees that she is no other than his divine love, Cynthia or Diana. They bid farewell to Peona with a promise that she should meet them many a time in these forests, and they vanish. Peona went home through the gloomy wood in wonderment. Its meaning. We have now to consider the meaning of this closing part of the story and its relation to the allegory as we have thus far traced it. Footnote. In his edition of the poems of Keats, Methuen 1907, Professor de Selincourt has given a more detailed explanation of the allegory as developed in the fourth book than has elsewhere been attempted. Although the line of treatment here followed differs in some respects from that which he has adopted, I wish to record with gratitude my obligation to his interpretation, which has been of more service than anything else that I have seen in opening up the way to a fuller understanding of the allegory. End footnote. The Cry of the Indian Maiden. The cry of the Indian maiden, with which the story resumes its way, represents the cry that is always going up from humanity in all quarters of the world for sympathy and help. To Endymion this was a new and unexpected appeal, and yet it is one to which his heart instinctively responded. So, Keats would tell us, in the development of the soul of the poet, as he knew it, the ambition to excel in poetry first took possession of him, and it was only after he had been pursuing this aim for a considerable time that a new desire began to appeal to him, the desire of doing something to serve his fellow men. This was not a new conception for Keats. In Sleep and Poetry, which had appeared in a volume published in March 1817, he outlines the same order of development. Oh, for 10 years that I may overwhelm myself in poesy, so may I do the deed that my own soul has to itself decreed. And after sketching symbolically the way in which he would spend this period of training, he goes on to say, And can I ever bid these joys farewell? Yes, I must pass them for a nobler life, where I may find the agonies, the strife of human hearts. But a new element is introduced into the later treatment of the idea, that of the clash between the two ideals, and the doubt and perplexity of mind that is the consequence of this clash. The conflict of ideals. So keenly did Endymion realise the trouble of the Indian maid, and so fully did his heart respond to her appeal, that he felt perplexed and troubled beyond endurance. He loved his mysterious goddess no less than before. His intense delight in the beauty of the moon was as great as ever, and these two had already appeared to him to be in strange conflict. Book 3, lines 175 to 187. For he had not recognised them as two phases of one devotion. And now, to add to his perplexity, he felt himself drawn by an irresistible attraction to the Indian maiden, to whose tale of sorrow he had listened. "I have a triple soul," he cried, torn by this painful conflict of feeling. Such, Keats would have us understand, is the trouble and perplexity in the mind of the poet when he looks upon beauty of form and intensity of feeling in poetry as separate and conflicting ideals, more especially when their rivalry is complicated by a larger desire to do some service of real value to mankind. To Endymion it seems at the moment that he cannot but yield to the cry for sympathy and help, sacrificing all his former hopes and ideals, though such a sacrifice must bring death as a consequence. "Thou art my executioner, and I feel Loving and hatred, misery and weal, will in a few short hours be nothing to me, and all my story that much passion slew me." Line 111. The Song of Sorrow. But the maiden does not see that Endymion's love for her need bring any such dire consequences in its train. Leaving this doubt unsolved, Endymion asks her about her former life, and in response she sings a song, one of the most beautiful things in the whole poem, telling of the mystery and the inevitability of sorrow in human life. She goes on to speak of her unsatisfied longing for sympathy. "In the whole world wide there was no one to ask me why I wept." Line 183. And then telling the story that is always being repeated in the history of the race, she relates how she tried to find satisfaction in the pursuit of pleasure. "And as I sat, over the light blue hills there came a noise of revellers. The rills into the wide stream came of purple hue. 'Twas Bacchus and his crew." Line 193. They called her to join them. "Come hither, lady fair, and joined be to our wild minstrelsy." Line 226. She followed their invitation, and through every clime watched humanity yielding to the call of pleasure, but it was of no avail. "Into these regions came I, following him, sick-hearted, weary, so I took a whim to stray away into these forests drear alone, without a peer, and I have told thee all thou mayest hear." Line 268. And she takes up again the song with which she began. "Come then, sorrow, sweetest sorrow, like an own babe I nursed thee on my breast. I thought to leave thee and deceive thee, but now of all the world I love thee best." Line 279. An unfortunate passage with a true meaning. It seems strange that after such a surpassingly beautiful rendering of one aspect of his theme, Keats should have allowed himself to lapse immediately into a strain of weak and maudlin sentiment that, for the moment, excuses the worst severity of his critics, but so it is. The lines in which Endymion declares his devotion to the maiden fall as far below the normal level of the poem as did the former passage in which he expressed his passion for the unknown goddess. We feel inclined to adopt the lines that follow and to apply them to this part of the poem, to cry a triple woe that such words went echoing dismally through the wide forest, a most fearful tone. Line 321. But it is not difficult to recognise the intention that underlies the passage, and this is no less true and cogent than the expression of it is false and deplorable. Keats is trying to show with what irresistible force the passion for humanity may lay hold of a man when his ears and heart are open to its sorrows, and how he is impelled to put aside all other claims in order to devote himself wholly to this one service. A no less passionate devotion had filled the soul of Endymion when his mysterious goddess had last visited him. Book 3, lines 739 to 761, and, though we may well wish that both passages had been written in a manner more worthy of the genius that sustained Keats through so much of his work, we cannot but recognise that the parallelism in itself adds a true significance to the poem. The cry of woe! While Endymion was pouring out his protestations of love, a voice was heard crying, "Woe! Woe! Woe to that Endymion!" One can find little or no help in this place towards the explanation of this incident, but if we compare it with the later passage, lines 632 and following, where Endymion again declares his readiness to sacrifice everything in order to devote himself exclusively to the new-found love, we may gain some light on its meaning. In each case he is checked, in this instance by the cry of woe, in the later one by the refusal of the maiden. "I may not be thy love," line 752. The intention in each case probably is to suggest that if the poet in his passion for humanity abandons his poetic ideals, he is committing a grave error which cannot result in good. The steeds. At this point in the story, Mercury appears and touches the earth with his wand. From it there spring two winged steeds. They evidently have a meaning similar to that of the chariot in Sleep and Poetry. They represent the power of the imagination. It may be noted that just as the chariot in the earlier poem appears immediately after the recognition by the poet of the necessity of entering into the agonies, the strife of human hearts, so in this case it is when he is distracted by the conflict of his feelings and is shuddering at the cry of woe that the intervention of Mercury takes place. Trusting himself to this new power, Endymion and his companion are carried aloft, far above the level of the earth. Endymion's readiness to follow divine leading. It is worthwhile turning back for a moment to note how this readiness of Endymion to commit himself to the guidance of what he felt to be a higher power offering to lead him is repeatedly illustrated in the course of the poem. It is suggested in each of the three original appearances, in the quickness with which he saw that some divine power was manifesting itself in the magic bed of flowers, Book 1, line 559, in his readiness to follow the cloudy Cupid flying above the well, Book 1, line 891, and again in his listening attitude before the voice called to him from the cave, and the eagerness with which he hurried in when he heard it, Book 1, line 960. But it is shown more clearly as the story proceeds. When the golden butterfly came out of the flower, he followed it with enthusiasm till it vanished, Book 2, line 66. And then, when further direction was given to him, he did not contend one moment in reflection, Book 2, line 215, but fled into the fearful deep. There, where the path that he was following ended, abrupt in middle air, Book 2, line 653, he threw himself without one impious word, Book 2, line 659, upon the eagle that crossed towards him, trusting himself unhesitatingly to this divine messenger, and caring not how perilous the adventure might seem. It was a similar instinct that led him to respond to the appeal of Glaucus for help, Book 3, lines 282 and 712, and to listen to the cry of the Indian maid, and, as we shall see, the consummation is reached when Endymion explicitly declares himself ready to submit entirely to the will of heaven, Book 4, line 974. inspiration and the poet. In all these instances Keats is showing us, by his usual method of concrete images, what he regards as the real meaning of poetic inspiration. There is the impulse or suggestion that appears to come from some source outside of the poet himself, but if any result is to follow, there must also be, on the part of the poet, a quickness to perceive and a readiness to respond to the promptings that come to him. It is, of course, a truth of wider application than that which is given to it here. But this is the aspect of it that belongs to the theme of the poem, and the repeated reference to the idea suggests how much value Keats placed upon it. It was a similar idea that he had pictured in Sleep and Poetry, when he represented the charioteer, the poet, as coming down in his car, the imagination, and while there pass before him shapes of delight and mystery and fear, he leans forward, most awfully intent, and seems to listen and writes with hurrying glow. It is a poet acting as the channel through which the divine can speak to humanity. In a letter written to Haydn, soon after he had begun to work at this poem, Keats gives expression to a similar feeling. Thank God, I do begin arduously where I leave off, notwithstanding occasional depressions, and I hope for the support of a high power while I climb this little eminence, Endymion, and especially in my years of more momentous labour. I remember your saying that you had notions of a good genius presiding over you. I have of late had the same thought, for things which I do at random are afterwards confirmed by my judgment in a dozen features of propriety. Is it too daring to fancy Shakespeare, this presider? The incidents of the flight as a personal reminiscence. The incidents that follow upon the appearance of Mercury and the mounting of Endymion and his companion on the jet black steeds, though they may be considered conflicting and pointless so far as the mere story is concerned, are full of significance as a revelation of the working of the poet's mind. They include the flagging of the steeds at the approach of sleep, the dream of Endymion and his waking consciousness of the presence of his divine love, his perplexity as he turns now to her, now to the maiden beside him, and feels drawn alike to both, yet convinced that he is not unfaithful to either. Then comes the effort that Endymion makes to rouse the steeds again, the rising of the moon, the vanishing of the Indian maid, and the entry of Endymion into the cave of quietude. In attempting to trace the significance of these incidents, we may, for the sake of clearness, think of them, in the first place, as representing a personal experience of the poet on some single occasion. Starting then a little further back than the series of events outlined above, we may picture him as sitting one evening and allowing his thoughts to centre round the agonies, the strife of human hearts, until he is led to wonder whether, after all, it were not better to try to do something to alleviate this suffering rather than to struggle on in the apparently hopeless effort to win fame as a poet. But before long his thoughts are touched as by an inspiration from heaven. He always saw ideas embodied, as Mr. Bradley justly remarks. His imagination is roused, and still keeping in mind the thought that had been with him before, he is carried aloft with a rush, and sees it all in a different light, under new aspects. Tired with the imaginative strain, he feels sleep coming upon him, and though he still tries to see more clearly what he is striving after, he does not succeed, and falling into unconsciousness, he begins to dream. His dream follows the line, not of his meditations of the moment, but of the ideas that have for a long time dominated his outlook upon life. He fancies that he has achieved his ideals as a poet, and that he has been found worthy to join the company of those whom he has reverenced as gods. He can take part in their life, and can a little use their instruments. Footnote: There is a poem entitled A Draught of Sunshine, edited Selincourt, page 353, which Keats sent to Reynolds in a letter of 31st of January 1818, the same letter in which he wrote out one of his most beautiful sonnets. when I have fears that I may cease to be. Endymion was at this time passing through the press and was receiving some final touches. It is probable that these lines refer to this part of the story, and thus have more point and value than has yet been allowed to them. End footnote. It is but a dream, and yet, when he wakes, it seems at first as if it were true, and he feels that this power is really his. He is indeed a poet. What has become of his desire to serve mankind? Must this be abandoned? In perplexity he turns from one ideal to the other, feeling that he is bound to follow each of them, yet not knowing how they can be reconciled. He calls to mind the flight of imagination which, before he fell asleep, had so magically uplifted these aspirations for service, and tries to renew this aspect of his thoughts. But a gleam of the old poetic desires that had so long haunted him comes into his mind. His passion to do something for humanity falls away, and, exhausted by the conflict of emotion through which he has passed, he sinks into a dreamless sleep. It is not, of course, intended to suggest that the experiences here outlined were necessarily confined to a single occasion. It may well have been that the desire to give some practical kind of help towards the relief of human suffering developed gradually in the mind of Keats, that there was more than one occasion on which the poetical impulse that was never far beneath the surface of his consciousness, acting on this desire, lifted it up into the region of creative imagination, and that periods of exhaustion and moods of apathy intervened. The significance of the story is not bound up with any particular time scheme, but whether it pictures for us the experience of a single occasion or one that was spread over some longer period of time, it represents a phase in the process of Keats' poetic development, and one that he regards as of more than personal significance. The Wedding Guests. While Endymion lay unconscious in the cave of quietude, there passed by a skyey mask, a pinioned multitude. Line 558. They sang a song in celebration of the coming marriage feast of Diana. We are probably intended to understand by this the attitude, not so much of the general public, as that section of it which has a genuine interest in poetry, and which recognises the early dawn of a new era, such as the new romantic movement in poetry. Among such as these there may be confidence and rejoicing at a time when the poet himself, who has given cause for such feelings, is still far from regarding his hopes as satisfied or his aims as accomplished. He may indeed be very little conscious of the interest and pleasure that others are taking in his work. Endymion returns to earth. Soon after this Endymion's steed descended. He found himself once more on the solid earth, and close at hand was the Indian maid. The dreams that he had cherished, the ideals after which he had striven, now appeared to him unreal, or at least hopeless of attainment, and he declared that he would put them aside and devote himself wholeheartedly to the service of his new-found love. But, to his unutterable dismay, she told him that this could not be. No such end to his perplexity and trouble was possible. He knew not how to answer her, and while he sat in a stupor of grief and despair, Peona came to greet them. The Poet and Practical Life. There is little difficulty in the interpretation of this part of the story, if we follow the track that has led us thus far. After a prolonged and lofty flight of the imagination, a reaction is bound to follow. The poet must inevitably come down to earth again, and once more find himself in contact with the troubles and pains of human life. And if these have before aroused his solicitude and sympathy, in the mood of such a reaction their appeal will be stronger than ever. Poetry, especially on the side of beauty of form and expression, may seem for the time an unpractical pursuit, especially if, after trying for long months and years to attain to lofty ideals, the poet is conscious that he has always fallen short of them. I have clung to nothing, loved nothing, nothing seen or felt but a great dream. Line 636. So he turns with a sigh of relief to a more direct and more practical way of helping mankind. The desires and ambitions that he has so long cherished appear now to be hopelessly unattainable, and he resolves that he will no longer be guilty of the folly of pursuing them. Against his proper glory has my own soul conspired. So my story will I to children utter, and repent. There never lived a mortal man who bent his appetite beyond his natural sphere, but starved and died. My sweetest Indian, here, here will I kneel, for thou redeemed hast my life from too thin breathing. Gone and past are cloudy phantasms. Caverns lone, farewell, and air of visions, and the monstrous swell of visionary seas. No, never more shall airy voices cheat me to the shore of tangled wonder, breathless and aghast. Adieu, my daintiest dream, although so vast my love is still for thee. The hour may come when we shall meet in pure Elysium. On earth I may not love thee. Line 643. Footnote. In a similar mood he wrote to Haydn, 11th of May 1817. There is no greater sin after the seven deadly than to flatter oneself into an idea of being a great poet. End footnote. But however welcome such a cutting of the Gordian knot may seem for the moment as a relief from the doubts and perplexities that he has been trying to face, no such resolve can be a permanent solution of his difficulties. The call of the divine ideal has been too clear, the response has been too spontaneous, the efforts to reach the ideal have been too intense, to be abandoned in this way, and humanity itself cannot accept of service rendered at such a cost. It would involve an unfaithfulness that could but lead to death, and the poet is, for a time, thrown back upon his perplexities and uncertainties. Returning to the scene of the earlier visions. There is some significance in the fact that, at this point of the story, Endymion is back again, though he is unconscious of it, in the very spot where he had first seen the vision that had called him out from the ordinary life of men. The long process of training through which Endymion had passed could not, of itself, make him a poet. Before that end could be attained, he must return to the source of inspiration that had given the original impulse to his new way of life. This is the essential element in the whole process, without which all the rest, useful and even necessary as it may be, must fail of its effect, for it is this inspiration that alone gives life and power to the words of the poet. Peona. The last occasion on which we heard of Peona was when she tried to soothe the spirit of Endymion, troubled by the early visions that he had seen, and to draw him back to his former natural and healthy manner of life. Line 991. During the period of his strange, fantastic wanderings, he has been far out of her ken, but now that he has returned once more to the scenes of his earlier youth, she comes to him with glad welcome, and rejoices in the hope of his resuming a more normal mode of life. There is nothing selfish in her attitude. She welcomes with open heart the beautiful stranger, but completely misinterprets the situation, and is reduced to bewildered amazement when Endymion puts all her hopeful suggestions on one side, declaring that he will live a hermit life, and that Peona herself shall be his only visitant. The perplexity of rival claims. The strange impasse to which the adventures of Endymion have led appears to represent, in a large measure, the personal experience of Keats, though the general situation has a wider meaning. There seems to have been a time when he was greatly perplexed and harassed in his outlook upon life. On the one hand, the desire of making his name live in the ranks of the poets was very strong within him. On the other, he was oppressed by the pains and sorrows of his fellow men, and longed to devote himself to their service. In the days when he was working as a medical student, poetry was, to his mind, the zenith of all his aspirations, the only thing worthy the attention of superior minds. Such is the record of one of his fellow students, already quoted. But a little later we find him writing, "I find there is no worthy pursuit but the idea of doing some good to the world. Footnote: to John Taylor, 24th of April 1818. This letter reads as if he had recently cleared up the difficulty referred to above. End footnote. And it would appear that, for a time, he could see no way of reconciling the two ideals. He was drawn most powerfully towards each of them, so much so that he could not, without pain, think of forsaking either. Yet for the time it seemed that he could not follow them both. He must choose between them. Still less was it possible to return to the ordinary life of men from which he had felt himself to be separated ever since he had seen the vision of poetic beauty. And so a feeling of depression settled down upon him. His ideals were unattainable. A return to his former life was impossible. There seemed to be no way out of the tangle of contradiction. He was inclined to seek for peace in solitude and to abandon both ideals as being beyond his reach. Yet he could find no satisfaction in such a decision. To cut himself off from the aims and aspirations that had lifted him above the ordinary ways of men would not give rest to his soul. Thus far it may be that we have been shown how the struggle and perplexity worked in the mind of Keats. The denouement is finally conceived and pictures for us a truth of universal significance. Endymion, feeling the impossibility of cutting himself off thus from all that he had longed for, begged Peona to bring the Indian maid that evening to meet him once more. They were to come to the groves behind the temple of Diana. So strongly did he feel the futility of all his hopes and efforts that at one moment he was ready to welcome death, though at another it seemed a cruel end to what he knew had been at least a sincere striving towards the light. The resolving of the perplexity. In this mood he approached the temple and met Peona and the Indian maid. When Peona asked him what was to happen next, his answer showed that he had reached some solution of his doubts and perplexities, the solution, that is, of willingness to submit entirely to the guidance of a higher power. "Sister, I would have command, if it were heaven's will, on our sad fate." Line 975. And then the final revelation is granted to him, and he learns, to his amazement and joy, that the goddess, whom he has so long pursued, but has never fully known, and the Indian maiden, who has called out his passionate devotion, are not rivals for his love, but are different aspects of the same being, whom he now knows in truth, and to whom he will henceforth be joined in deathless delight. So it is, Keats would tell us, when the poet comes to realise that his longing aspirations after beauty and perfection in his poetry, and his passionate desire to serve his fellow creatures, are not conflicting ideals, but are one and the same, that for him to use faithfully and earnestly his poetic gift is to render the highest service to mankind. Then he has become a true poet. Peona's share. It is a pleasant little touch that Peona is not shut out from a share in this joyful climax, though she fails to comprehend its meaning. The poet's ways are in a large measure ways where others cannot follow him, yet he does not lose touch with their life. And the men and women, not a small company, to whom poetry is little better than sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal, and who find it incomprehensible that a lifetime should be devoted to it, may yet have some share in the beauty and joy that it brings into human life. The introduction to the fourth book. The introduction to this book dwells on the way in which English poetry, refusing to be merely imitative of even the best of what other lands could offer, waited until the time had come to develop its own genius. And Keats feels that the new movement in poetry, with the celebration of which this poem is largely concerned, represents the full fruition of the hopes that had so long been waiting for fulfilment. The note thus sounded is in harmony with the triumphant close to which the story finally attains. End of section. Section 5 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Glaucus in Keats' Endymion. The story of Glaucus, as it is told by Keats in the third book of Endymion, is based upon some passages in the 13th and 14th books of Ovid's Metamorphoses. There is still some difference of opinion as to the meaning that Keats intended to convey by this part of his poem, and an examination of the way in which he has handled his materials and the changes that he has introduced into the story may throw light on the question at issue. The story, as given by Ovid, runs as follows. Glaucus was a fisherman, taking great delight in the sea and spending his life on or near it. One day, having come to a meadow which had never before been visited by man or beast, he spread out on the bank the fishes that he had caught. To his surprise he saw them, after nibbling at the grass on which they lay, move over the land and slip down again into the sea. He wondered what cause could have worked such a marvel, and himself plucked and tasted some of the grass. At once his nature was changed. He plunged into the sea and was fit to be received into the sacred fellowship of the sea gods. Then he met Scylla and loved her, but she fled from him, and not being able to induce her to listen to him, he appealed to Circe for help. But Circe replied, according to the version of George Sandys of which Keats made use, "The willing with more ease pursue, who wish the same, whom equal flames subdue. For thou, O well deservedst to be pursued. Give hope and credit me, thou shalt be wooed. Rest therefore of thy beauty confident. Lo, I, a goddess, radiant soul's descent, in herbs so potent, and no less in charms, proffer myself and pleasures to thy arms. Scorn her that scorns thee, her that seeks pursue, and in one deed revenge thyself of two." Glaucus, however, rejected her advances. "First shady groves shall on the billows grow, and seaweeds to the mountain tops remove, ere I and Scylla living change my love." Circe was angered, but not being able, nor indeed willing, to harm Glaucus, who was now, like herself, divine, she bent her wrath upon Scylla. She poisoned a pool where Scylla was wont to bathe. Now Scylla came, and, wading to the waist, beheld her hips with barking dogs embraced. Starts back, at first not thinking that they were part of herself, but rates them, and doth fear their threatening jaws. But those from whom she flies, she with her hails. Glaucus wept at the change, and refused to have anything to do with Circe. Scylla, in hatred of Circe, destroyed the companions of Ulysses, and was only prevented from sinking the Trojan ships by being further transformed into a rock, the stony prodigy yet eminent from which the seamen fly. When we turn to Endymion to see in what fashion Keats has handled this curious legend, the first point that attracts our notice is that he has made no use of the quaint and picturesque account of the way in which Glaucus came to win the freedom of the sea. The fishes that used the magic properties of the grass to get back into the sea, and thus showed Glaucus how he could enter the new life for which he longed, play no part in the story as it is told in the pages of Endymion. In this poem, Glaucus, impelled by his desire for the sea, simply plunged for life or death, and found, to his astonishment, that he could live in the denser element. It appears at first sight rather surprising that such a promising bit of material should have been cast aside. But if Keats had some meaning to express with which the incident could not be related, one can see why it had to be rejected, even though the story was thereby rendered more tame and flat. It would carry us beyond the limits available to attempt to discuss every detail of the narrative, but we may select 4 leading points where Keats has introduced original elements into it, and examine these with a view to seeing what light they may throw on the purpose underlying this part of the poem. 1. In the story of Glaucus himself, there is at the outset a strong resemblance to that of Endymion. Each lives a life in close contact with nature. Each delights in solitude, while showing a kindly disposition towards those around him who cannot share his aspirations or even understand them. Each again feels a restless longing for a life different from that which he has been living, and in each there springs up an intense desire for union with a being, or the attainment of an ideal, only to be achieved after a long period of probation. The later story is not, however, a mere repetition of the earlier. Endymion was a prince and a wanderer of the forest and mountain, while Glaucus was a fisherman, and his delight was all in the sea. And they soon diverge from one another, for while Endymion, though sometimes despondent, remains faithful throughout to the ideal that he is striving to reach, Glaucus yields to the baleful charms of Circe, and, forgetting Scylla, gives himself up to the pleasures with which his new mistress surrounds him. So Keats tells the story, but it was not thus that he found it in Ovid, for Ovid says that Glaucus firmly and decisively rejected the advances of Circe. Footnote: Talia temptanti prius inquit in aequore frondes, Glaucus, et summis nascentur montibus algae, sospite quam Scylla nostri mutentur amores. Metamorphoses, Book 14, line 37. End footnote. Here, then, if Keats is not inventing at random, we may look for a clue to the meaning of the story. It is generally accepted that the story of Endymion, as told by Keats, was intended to represent the growth of the poetic passion in the mind of the poet, and if this be so, we can hardly fail to recognise the significance in the close similarity which the earlier part of the story of Glaucus bears to that of Endymion. In each we have the same unsatisfied longings, the same reaching after an apparently unattainable ideal, and if the aspirations of Endymion stand for the rise of the poetic impulse in an individual or in a community, it seems difficult to refuse a similar significance to those of Glaucus. And the divergence of their stories suggests that while the later poetic movement, represented by Endymion, remained faithful to the ideal that inspired it, the earlier, for which Glaucus stands, had been seduced from the loftiness of purpose that had at first inspired it, and had followed lower and less worthy aims. Had English poetry ever passed through an experience of this kind? It is beyond question that Keats believed that it had, and the picture that he draws, with no authority from Ovid, of Glaucus, forgetting the beautiful maiden who eluded his pursuit, and yielding to the lower fascinations of the evil-minded enchantress, is quite an effective presentation of his view of what had happened to English poetry in the days of the pseudo-classical school. He felt that it had then forsaken the ideal after which it had been striving, and had allowed itself to fall under the allurements of a false enticement. And the punishment that Circe inflicted upon Glaucus when he discovered her exercising her baleful charms upon other victims, a punishment invented by Keats in wilful disregard of the statement of Ovid that Circe could do no such thing. Footnote: Indignata dea est, et ledere quatenus ipsum non poterat, nec velit amans. Metamorphoses, Book 14, line 40. End footnote. Was the punishment that fell upon English poetry as the direct result of yielding to these enticements. It lost all poetic force and fell into decrepitude. They went about holding a poor decrepit standard out, as Keats himself has put it in another place. Whether we accept or differ from this view of Pope and his school is of no moment. The point is that this revision of the story of Glaucus forms a very effective pictorial representation of the view that was held and proclaimed by Keats and others who were associated with him in the new poetical movement. 2. The changes that Keats has made in the story, as it concerns Scylla, are in harmony with this interpretation. In the Metamorphoses, the vengeance of Circe falls mainly upon her, and she is changed into a hideous shape, surrounded by ravening dogs. Nor is she ever restored to her former beauty, but in Endymion no such disfigurement is allowed to overtake her. Circe merely puts her into a death-like trance, in which her beauty is not marred, and from which she is eventually restored to life. And we can understand this change if we recognise that Scylla, like Diana, stands for a poetical ideal, beautiful and attractive in itself, but ceasing, as Keats felt, to exercise any living power over men during the time of which we have spoken. The story, as told by Ovid, is picturesque and striking, but it would not carry the meaning that was required. Keats could not speak of the ideal as changed into something ugly and monstrous. It had become powerless for a time, but one day it would live again, and draw men after it as before. And so the story of Scylla is modified to suit the meaning that was to be conveyed. 3. In describing the part that Circe plays in the story, Keats has used the narrative of the Metamorphoses as a starting point, and has also drawn upon his reminiscences of the account of her given in the 10th book of the Odyssey. But here again, the line that he takes soon begins to diverge from that of his predecessors. In his version of the story, Glaucus waked one morning and found that Circe was not with him. He searched through the forest, and at length came upon her seated upon an uptorn forest root, and surrounded by the creatures over whom she was tyrannizing. She fed them with grapes from a basket, and then, having sprinkled a branch of mistletoe with some sooty oil, she whisked it in their eyes. They shrieked and groaned with pain, their bodies began to swell, and then, carried through the air as if by a whirlwind, they vanished. Footnote: Endymion, Book 3, lines 476 to 530. End footnote. It is a most fantastic story, and it seems unlikely that Keats would, in wanton idleness of fancy, have turned it into such a grotesque form. It is more reasonable to suppose that he had some purpose in view. Circe obviously stands for an influence of a very sinister kind, and, if the line of interpretation already suggested is the true one, it follows that he must represent, in some way, the activities of the pseudo-classical school, and a detailed examination of the passage will show that it bears distinct marks of having been developed, with very little help from Ovid or Homer, so as to present a portrait, or a caricature, not so much of the classical school in general, as of its chief representative, Alexander Pope, in particular. We have the central and commanding position that Pope occupied among the swarm of petty scribblers and satirists of his day, and all around her shapes, wizard and brute, laughing and wailing, grovelling, serpentining, showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag, and sting. Oh, such deformities! Endymion, Book 3, line 500. His overbearing attitude towards these minor poets. Fierce, wan, and tyrannizing was the lady's look, line 506. The contemptuous way in which he flung his poems to the admirers and flatterers by whom he was surrounded, and the eagerness with which they received them. Oft times upon the sudden she laughed out, and from a basket emptied to the rout clusters of grapes, the which they ravened quick and roared for more. Line 509. Then follows a lively sketch of the way in which Pope turned upon these versifiers and spattered them with the acid of his satire. Avenging, slow, anon she took a branch of mistletoe, and emptied on't a black dull gurgling phial, groaned one and all, as if some piercing trial was sharpening for their pitiable bones. She lifted up the charm, appealing groans from their poor breasts went suing to her ear in vain. Remorseless as an infant's bier, she whisked against their eyes the sooty oil, whereat was heard a noise of painful toil, increasing gradual to a tempest rage, shrieks, yells, and groans of torture pilgrimage. The details have been selected so as to correspond with remarkable exactness to the facts. The first two words, avenging, slow, one of which at least is not particularly appropriate for Circe, for she had nothing to avenge, her anger had not yet been roused against Glaucus, can be used with the exactness of the Dunciad, which has been described as a plan of vengeance, long meditated, carefully matured and skilfully executed by the poet. The character of the contents, the anger and consternation that followed its appearance, the attitude of the author, are all depicted with an incisive humour which is the sign of Keats' growing mastery over his work. The close adherence to the facts of the case is further marked by the division of the torment into two stages, of which the first is more of the nature of a threat, while the second is an open attack. This is exactly what had happened, for in March 1727 to 1728 there had appeared a volume of miscellanies by Swift and Pope, in which was included a treatise in prose on bathos, or the art of sinking in poetry. In this Pope satirises various classes of writers of his time, but the attack is not often personal, and individual writers are indicated only by initials which Pope declared to have chosen at random. It caused no small outcry. Groaned one and all as if some piercing trial was sharpening for their pitiable bones. And this proved to be the case, for a few months later the Dunciad was published, and in this the numerous writers who fell under the poet's lash found themselves attacked by name, and the satire was more personal and more biting. The lines in which the outcome of the whole affair is described form a startling climax. Then a sight, more wildering than all that horse affright, for the whole herd, as by a whirlwind writhen, went through the dismal air like one huge python antagonizing Boreas, and so vanished. Yet there was not a breath of wind, she banished these phantoms with a nod. As an incident in the story, it is grotesque in the extreme. As an account of Circe's magic, it is quite unauthorized by any of the classical sources upon which Keats was supposed to be drawing, but as a description of the effect of the Dunciad upon the minor poets of Pope's time, it is the simple truth. They have all vanished from the realms of literature, and today only those who have made a special study of the period could tell even their names. If further evidence is needed to show that Circe is intended to represent Pope in this passage, it will be found in the pages of the Bathos, to which reference has already been made. From that work it may be seen that the identification did not originate with Keats, but with no less an authority than Pope himself. In the 6th chapter he says, "I shall range these confined and less copious geniuses under proper classes, and, the better to give their pictures to the reader, under the names of animals of some sort or other. 1. The flying fishes. These are writers who now and then rise upon their fins and fly out of the profound, but their wings are soon dry, and they drop down to the bottom. G.S. A.H. C.G. Meaning George Stepney, Aaron Hill, and Charles Gilden. 2. The swallows are authors that are eternally skimming and fluttering up and down, but all their agility is employed to catch flies. L.T. W.P. Lord H. Lewis Theobald, William Pulteney, Lord Hervey." And in the following paragraphs he represents other writers as ostriches, parrots, they that repeat another's words in such a hoarse odd voice as makes them seem their own, didappers, porpoises, frogs, eels, and tortoises. And having thus transformed his victims after the manner of Circe, he proceeds in the following chapter with cynical impertinence to save his former friend Broom. The author's pencil, like the wand of Circe, turns all into monsters at a stroke. Warton, in his edition of Pope, published about 20 years before Endymion was written, says of chapter 6, "This was the chapter that gave so much offence, and excited such loud clamours against our author by his introduction of these initial letters, which he in vain asserted were placed at random and meant no particular writers, which was not believed. It seems sufficiently evident that we have here the origin of the Circe episode in Endymion. 4. In a culmination of the story we find Keats departing altogether from the authority to which he has hitherto paid some degree of attention, and striking out a line of his own. In the Metamorphoses, Scylla is changed into a rock, and becomes a menace to those who sail between Sicily and Italy, but in Endymion she is restored to active life and to her former beauty, and her union with Glaucus is crowned with the blessing of Neptune. It is a startling change, and no less so is the account of the means by which the restoration was brought about. It appears to be a pure invention on the part of Keats, and is either a wanton piece of triviality without sense or meaning, as we are sometimes invited to believe, or it is a pictorial representation of one of the great events in the history of English literature. If the interpretation that has been outlined above represents at all accurately what Keats meant by the story of Glaucus, as he had found it in Ovid and modified it to suit his own purpose, it is evident that he would, at this point, be faced by the necessity of devising some method of representing the sequel. He had shown us how English poetry, falling under the baleful influence of the classical school, had become ineffective and impotent, but he could not leave it there. He was conscious that a new life had been breathed into poetry since the time of Pope, and was even then pulsing through its veins. And so he invents the account of the way in which Glaucus was restored to youth and vigour. The passage is too long to quote. Endymion, Book 3, lines 645 and following. But the essence of it is that Glaucus, sitting one day on a rock, saw a gallant vessel approaching. As she came nearer, a tempest arose. She was wrecked, and the feebleness which the curse of Circe had brought upon him prevented Glaucus from saving any of those who cried for help. As he was lamenting his inability to rescue them, there emerged from the waters at his feet an old man's hand, grasping a scroll and a wand. He laid hold of these, and even caught the old man's finger, but it slipped through his enfeebled grasp, and the last survivor of the wreck perished. The scroll, however, was saved. Glaucus read it with rapt attention, and found in it a promise of redemption. When Endymion came to him, the magic power of the scroll was made evident. Torn into pieces and scattered by the hand of Endymion in the face of Glaucus, it restored him to youthful vigour, while Scylla and all those whose bodies had been tended by Glaucus during the time of his decrepitude were brought back to life by the same means. The story is fantastic enough, but when the details are examined, it will be found that they show, in picturesque form, how the revival of poetry was brought about in the latter part of the 18th century. It has long been recognised that in Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry we have the most complete embodiment of the forces that were at work to produce this result. Wordsworth bears emphatic testimony to this effect. For our own country, he says, its poetry has been absolutely redeemed by it. Footnote: Essay supplementary to the preface to the 1815 edition of Wordsworth's poems. There appears to be something more than an accidental connection between this essay and the part of Endymion under consideration. In an earlier passage, Wordsworth speaks of the arts by which Pope contrived to procure to himself a more general and a higher reputation than perhaps any English poet ever attained during his lifetime. He refers to the undue exertion of these arts, and speaks of Pope as having bewitched the nation by his melody. We learn from Keats' letters that he was staying at Oxford with his friend Bailey at the time when he was writing the Story of Glaucus, and that they had been reading Wordsworth together. Letter to Reynolds, 21st of September, 1817. End footnote. And later criticism has confirmed this point of view. Sir Richard Garnett, for example, says that it made an era not only in English but in European literature, affording the date from which, upon the whole, the commencement of the Romantic School may most fitly be reckoned. And Keats sketches in the story of it with vivid strokes. The vessel that comes from the horizon's brink stands for the ballad literature that had come down from the earlier centuries and in which men were beginning to take a new interest. The wrecking of the ship and the gulfing of all on board represent the disappearance of the great mass of the ballads and the complete oblivion that has overtaken their authors. The crew had gone by one and one to pale oblivion. Much more might have been rescued from the remains of this part of our literature, Keats tells us, but for the paralysing influence of the pseudo-classical school. Oh, they had all been saved, but crazed eld annulled my vigorous cravings, and thus quelled and curbed, think on't, O Latmian, did I sit writhing with pity and a cursing fit against that hell-born Circe. Endymion, Book 3, line 661. But a scroll was saved from the wreck, and here, with a broadly realistic touch, is represented the famous manuscript out of which the relics grew. Just as Percy was barely in time to save it from destruction, so the scroll was with difficulty, and only at the last moment, rescued from the waves, and as the unknown transcriber of the manuscript sank into oblivion, though his work was preserved, so the hand that held out the scroll to Glaucus slipped through his grasp, and the unknown benefactor sank out of sight. As a story of a wreck, there is little point or meaning about it, but it gains in both if it is intended to represent the central incident in the revival of poetry. The scroll saved by Glaucus contained the promise of deliverance from his miserable state, but attached to the promise were two conditions. Endymion, Book 3, lines 696 and following. The first of these is stated simply and directly. He must study nature with sincere and earnest purpose to understand her meaning. The second is given in a more symbolical manner. All lovers, tempest-tossed, and in the savage overwhelming lost, he shall deposit side by side, until time's creeping shall the dreary space fulfil. By which is meant that the reverent regard paid to the older poets during the age of Pope was one of the conditions that helped to make the later revival possible. Pope himself had a great reverence for Spenser, but it would be difficult to trace any effective influence that Spenser exerted upon him. So we are told that these bodies lay to all appearance dead, deposited side by side, on the shelves of those who could draw no living inspiration from them. But their beauty remained unspoiled. Endymion found their patient lips all ruddy, for here death no blossom nips. Line 739. It was from these two sources that the new romantic movement drew much of its inspiration, a sympathetic study of nature and a reverent regard for the great poets of earlier times. Neither the relics, however, nor the fulfilment of these conditions could, of themselves, effect the deliverance of poetry. They could do no more than quell one half of the witch. Line 644. A living force was needed, and so it was not until Endymion, representing the spirit of the new poetry, came upon the scene that any change could be brought about. He it was who, scattering in the face of Glaucus some pieces of the scroll, restored him to youthful vigour, and then, showering these powerful fragments on Scylla and on the files of seemingly dead bodies, brought them back to life. Thus was accomplished the revival of poetry, which meant so much to those who shared in it that they wandered to and fro, distracted with the richest overflow of joy that ever poured from heaven. Lines 804 and following. When this interpretation of Keats' rendering of the story of Glaucus was first put forward, with less evidence in support of it than has now been adduced, some critics accepted it, but others, whose opinion one cannot but respect, pronounced a verdict of not proven. This fresh presentation of the argument may perhaps justify a reconsideration of the verdict, but in any case it is worth while to consider very briefly the alternatives that are open if this interpretation be not accepted. It is clear that Keats either meant what has here been suggested, or he had some other meaning in mind, or he meant nothing in particular, and was merely allowing his imagination to wander at random. No other meaning, however, appears to have been proposed for this part of the story, so that this alternative does not call for discussion. The view that is taken, so far as one can gather, by those who have hitherto felt unable to accept the present interpretation, is that Keats had no definite meaning in mind in writing this story, which amounts to saying that Keats, in the middle of what he was trying to make a great poem, allowed himself to wander from the point, and to indulge for pages at a time in writing irrelevant nonsense that had no bearing upon anything in particular. Now, there is an inherent improbability about this position, greater than appears to be realised by those who have assumed it. That the poem as a whole has a meaning and a purpose is common ground. Sir Sidney Colvin, who cannot be claimed as a supporter of the interpretation here put forward, states it thus: "The tale of the loves of the Greek shepherd prince and the moon goddess turns under his hand into a parable of the adventures of the poetic soul striving after full communion with the spirit of essential beauty." Professor Oliver Elton puts it in a similar way: "The pains and pleasures that come to the poetic soul in its search for ideal beauty are figured under Endymion's adventures, and the moon herself is the image of such beauty. But if a real significance underlies the figure of Endymion and the story of his adventures, it is surely unlikely that the figure of Glaucus and the story of his adventures, which fill nearly the whole of the third book of the poem, have no significance, but are mere meaningless fancies, especially in view of the fact that Endymion himself is closely linked up with them." Moreover, the subject with which Keats was dealing was the one on which, of all possible subjects, he was least likely to write irrelevant nonsense. Poetry was to his mind, says one of his fellow students in the medical school, the zenith of all his aspirations, the only thing worthy the attention of superior minds. So he thought. All other pursuits were mean and tame. He had no idea of fame or greatness, but as it was connected with the pursuits of poetry, or the attainment of poetical excellence. The greatest men in the world were the poets, and to rank among them was the chief object of his ambition. And bearing this in mind, one is compelled to feel that the improbability of his representing in picturesque form his ideas about an important, though to him an objectionable, phase of English poetry, in the course of a poem which admittedly deals with some aspects of that subject, is less than the improbability of his scribbling grotesque and meaningless pictures across the pages of such a poem. Keats was a thinker as well as a singer, and to suppose that he would have allowed himself to fill up a poem of this kind with mere idle dreaming, having no point or sense, seems neither fair to the poet nor critically sound. It has been shown that the variations on the original story, which are due to the invention of Keats, fit with peculiar exactness into the interpretation that has been outlined above. This interpretation corresponds with the views which Keats is known to have held on the classical school of poetry, and the most natural inference would appear to be that this is the meaning which he intended to convey. That he has not succeeded in conveying it to the majority of those who have read the poem, probably not a very large number, must be admitted. He was, as we know from his letters, tired of the poem before he had done with it, and was, no doubt, disappointed, as the artist usually is, at the difference between his original conception and the form into which he had shaped it. The ridicule which was poured upon it by a few, and the indifference of the world at large, added to his own feeling about the poem, would leave him with little inclination to explain what he meant by it. And so, in those of his letters which have come down to us, though he must have written many others, there is little or nothing to help us in tracing out its intention. But the verdict of Keats' contemporaries has long been set aside. Together with many weaknesses and imperfections, it is now agreed that Endymion contains much that is beautiful and effective, and if we recognise in it a richer meaning and a more definite purpose than has hitherto been suspected, we lose nothing of our delight in its poetic beauty, but gain a sense of reality and significance that can only add to its value. Stellenbosch, South Africa, 23rd of February 1921. End of section. End of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. Read by Algie Pug.